periods in British history, the English Civil War, also known as the Wars of the Three Kingdoms. This tumultuous conflict, which raged across the 17th century, was marked by intense battles, deep-seated religious strife, and a web of complex political problems that tore a nation apart, from the blood-soaked fields of Edgehill to the besieged city of York, and from the epic showdowns at Marston Moor to the siege of Oxford. It was a war that pitted brother against brother, father against son, as opposing forces fought for their vision of England's future. The battle lines were often drawn along religious beliefs, adding a layer of intensity to an already heated struggle. But the English Civil War was not just a religious war, it was a social and political powder keg waiting to explode. The monarchy, led by King Charles I Stuart, clashed with Parliament over issues of power and taxation. This political turmoil set the stage for a nation divided, and the consequences would reshape England forever. Join us as we unravel the dramatic and complex tapestry of the English Civil War, exploring its battles, religious strife, and political problems that forever altered the course of history. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and give us a thumbs up, that helps immensely. As brother turns against brother, it might be good to keep your sympathies private. Easier to do back when every step you take didn't get recorded on a server somewhere in the world. Well, perhaps you know how to keep things private despite that. Use a VPN, such as our sponsor for this video, NordVPN, with a special offer available at nordvpn.com/kingsandgenerals. NordVPN gives you the luxury of network security. If you make a wrong turn, NordVPN will turn you back instantly. No one passing you by in cyberspace can pick your pockets, so to speak. Trackers can't track you, advertisers can't manipulate you, and criminals can't breach your invisible defenses. That's the security you get with NordVPN. And these days you're only putting yourself at risk by carrying on without it. And of course a VPN means a customizable IP address, and that means you get the entire internet, not only the parts region locked to where you normally browse from. Now for that offer, by using our exclusive link nordvpn.com/kingsandgenerals, you get 4 bonus months added on top of your NordVPN plan. There's a 30-day risk-free money-back guarantee. If you start using NordVPN, then decide against it. So there's no harm in at least trying it out. Get that offer and secure your link to the internet at nordvpn.com/kingsandgenerals. The Stuart dynasty came to power in England when the childless Elizabeth I died on March 24, 1603, and was succeeded by King of Scotland, James VI, who then also became James I of England. This reign united the realms of England, Scotland, and Ireland under one monarch for the first time, and saw an increase in the popularity of divine right, the God-given authority of a monarch to rule as he wished, unhindered by his nobles or people. After 22 years on the throne, during which momentous events such as the sailing of the Mayflower and Guy Fawkes' gunpowder plot took place, King James died in March 1625, and was succeeded by his second son, who ascended to the throne as Charles I. A scholarly-oriented man with a penchant for hunting, it immediately became clear that Charles had inherited his father's enthusiasm for divine right, and began acting in ways which profoundly angered influential factions in his country, the most important of which being Parliament. Today, the British Houses of Lords and Commons are the governing institutions of the United Kingdom, but in the mid-17th century this was not yet the case. The king still had executive decision-making authority, and his decree was the only means by which Parliament could legally convene. However, by the mid-1600s, the Houses had gained significant de facto power, such as the ability to raise taxes far more effectively and smoothly than the king himself, making it hard for English monarchs to operate without parliamentary approval. Upon ascending to the throne in 1625, the outwardly Protestant Charles married Henrietta Maria, the staunchly Catholic sister of France's King Louis XIII. While this was at first viewed as a shrewd diplomatic move, Maria's fervently pro-Catholic actions made the predominantly reformed English despise her. This religious dimension of the royal parliamentary divide was made worse by a number of factors, both internal and external. In mainland Europe, the 30 Years' War was raging without end. Many in England, and particularly in Parliament, wished to take up arms in order to prevent the Catholic Counter-Reformation from snuffing out their Protestant brothers, but Charles would not do so in a direct fashion. The meagre attempts in 1625 and 1628 of Charles to intervene at Cadiz and the Siege of La Rochelle respectively were blundered and only increased tension between the king and his parliament. Even worse than this was the increasing influence of William Laud, the intrusive Bishop of London, who advocated an anti-Calvinist sect of Protestantism known as Arminianism. This denomination rolled some Christian practices back closer to those of the Roman Catholic Church, and was viewed as yet another sign that Charles I was dangerously friendly to the hated Papists. All of these factors gradually ratcheted up the tension between Parliament and the monarchy. In short, it was making England a powder keg. More tangible issues were also at the heart of the Gulf, the most prominent of which was a growing opposition of the propertied classes in Parliament to the absolute rule of their monarch. The first Parliament called by the king in 1625 got off to a bad start on this front because of that most enduring of issues, taxes. Usually, Parliament would grant a new monarch permission to levy customs duties, called tonnage and poundage, for an entire reign. But for Charles, they only gave such permission for 1 year. Parliament did grant levels of funding and taxation that would have been adequate in the past, but that was woefully inadequate when taking into account inflation and other costs. With Parliament continuously unwilling to grant sufficient funding, Charles began to raise money by his own means. Money was borrowed, with the crown jewels as security for repayment. Tonnage and poundage customs were collected regardless of parliamentary approval, and, most annoying to those affected, so-called forced loans were imposed on Charles's wealthier subjects. Overall, Charles raised over £250,000, but these measures caused anger and resentment. Many gentlemen refused to pay and were imprisoned, while others hindered the actions of local collectors and were similarly jailed by royal decree without trial. Because this method of imprisonment was normally only used when the state was in exceptional danger, Charles's use of it was viewed as abuse. When Parliament was summoned again in 1628, a representative named Sir Edward Coke authored the Petition of Right, a document which set out a list of specific liberties which Charles would be absolutely forbidden from infringing. Amongst other things, primary concerns were the illegality of arbitrary imprisonment and tax collection without parliamentary consent. In desperate need of parliamentary approval for funding, the king eventually accepted this document, but it is widely believed that he simply believed he was just reaffirming age-old liberties and was not conceding anything new. One of the main proponents of the petition was a staunch opponent of the king called John Pym, who would later become a parliamentary leader. Tensions escalated further when in 1629 a dispute about continuing royal customs collection was viewed by Parliament as an illegal contradiction of the Petition of Right. When the exasperated king ordered Parliament to adjourn, members held the Speaker, John Finch, in his chair so that the session could not formally end. He was held there long enough for resolutions against Charles's religious reforms and his collection of royal duties to be read out, a slight which was too much for the king. So on March 10, 1629, Charles I dissolved Parliament and arrested some of the ringleaders who had been behind the unrest, inadvertently making them martyrs and providing a rallying cry for those who opposed the absolute rule. With the would-be cash cow Parliament disbanded, the king made peace with his foreign enemies and embarked on a period of sole rule. To his supporters it was the personal rule, but to his enemies it was the more sinister-sounding 11 years tyranny. There is a general assumption that this decade-long period must have been very evil by its nature. While many occurrences within these twilight years of peace directly led to the strife of the 1640s and 50s, it was not nearly as horrific as it's often portrayed. In England, personal rule began quite positively. While hardcore Puritans, radical Protestants who were convinced that the Reformation was only half done, thought that so-called High Church Arminianism was the devil's work, the common man was not as opposed. Many ordinary people responded quite positively to the more formal approach to religion and readily embraced William Laud's moderate reforms at the beginning of the 1630s. Even Henrietta Maria became more docile, and it's clear that the personal rule was a happy time for the royal family in a personal sense. The Queen even gave birth to a child named Charles in May of 1630, a child who 3 decades later would be King of England in his own right. Younger Charles's birth was supposedly celebrated with great enthusiasm across all 3 kingdoms that the Stuart dynasty held sovereignty over, with bonfires lit in the baby's honour. It must have been a happy time which the royals were soon to look back on with sorrow. Later, as a widow in her native France, Maria described her feelings during the 1630s golden years, stating that, "I was the happiest and most fortunate of queens, for not only had I every pleasure the heart could desire, I had a husband who adored me." In continental Europe, the situation calmed somewhat during the personal rule, with the death of Gustavus Adolphus at Lutzen in 1632. Despite the Swedish king's reputation as a hero of Protestantism, the stalemate which ensued in the aftermath of his passing began to decrease the level of religious fear and paranoia felt in English society. Catholic dominance of the 30 Years' War during the 1620s had conjured a spectre of yet another invasion of the British Isles. With the stalemate, the threat deteriorated significantly, if it was ever possible at all. Meanwhile, Charles proved himself a champion of theatre, painting, architecture, music, and other aspects of high culture. Overall, a Capuchin priest named Father Cyprien reported back to his superiors in France that England is an abundant country and has no taxes. The inhabitants lead a luxurious life, far removed from the poverty of other places. As we will see, however, all was not well in England. Despite the Queen's increasing contentment, her zealous Catholicism was set to be an insurmountable problem for Charles. However much he tried, suspicious Protestant doubters would forever believe that Maria was attempting to use her position to slide England back into the grip of Rome. The Queen's many Catholic attendants who had accompanied her to England also proved themselves an issue, though not in Charles's own opinion. The king actually seemed to find the Catholic courtiers quite charming and found himself able to relax in their company. It is crucial to note in Charles's defense that he does not seem to have been going Catholic in any way, but had polarized interests which made it seem like he was. Specifically, he was tolerant of Catholics and an enemy to the extreme Puritans whom he and his new Archbishop of Canterbury saw as a threat. Upon ascending to that position in 1633, Laud began to overreach his authority and make everything worse for almost everyone who didn't share his own view on church matters. In addition to his Pope-light innovations to the Church of England, which convinced many Puritans that they were gradually being delivered to the Catholic Church on a silver platter, Laud also repeatedly forbade this. Despite raising over £30,000 per year for the king, this policy angered almost everyone else. Merchants excluded by the monopoly were annoyed because they couldn't trade, and regular labourers were annoyed because under monopolies, prices tended to rise in return for inferior products. Most infamous was the soap monopoly. Dubbed popish soap, this product supposedly blistered the hands of those using it, and because of the Catholic Manufacturing Board of the monopolist company, was said to blister the soul of Protestants as well. Charles also began reintroducing obsolete medieval laws in strange ways, reviving ancient fines on knights, people living in royal forests, and people building homes outside of designated areas in London. These fines were originally designed to coerce the fined individual into stopping a certain action, moving out of the forest, for example. But Charles did not want the individual to cease the action because he wanted to keep fining them and bringing in the money. While this was a technically legal and clever use of the letter of the law, it went against the spirit of the law and was widely viewed as unjust. The king's most infamous fundraising measure was called ship money, which was reintroduced in its original form in 1634. It essentially served as an emergency financial levy in case of invasion, which allowed the king to collect money if there was no time to call parliament. Maritime counties would contribute funds for the construction of ships, which would then theoretically be used in defense of those counties. It was a fair system if employed as it was intended, but of course Charles I found a way to make it despised. Supported by the meddlesome Archbishop Laud, Charles extended the collection of ship money to inland areas as well, areas which were traditionally exempt due to their lack of a coast. Moreover, the collection of ship money was an emergency levying of funds, and there was no true emergency. However, the king got around this by having his lawyers bring up an old statute dictating that it was the king who determined what was or was not an emergency. So, the king got his money at first. When the ship money tithe was repeated year after year, though, it became a massive problem to Parliament. After all, annual monetary tithes are in reality taxes, and taxes could only legally be raised with parliamentary consent, however much the king tried to legally state that it was not a tax. Naturally, all of this generated intense resistance from such individuals as John Hampden, whose actions in 1637 challenging ship money gave him a reputation as a champion of individual liberty. It also connected the parliamentary cause with property rights. Throughout the latter part of his personal rule, opposition began to mount increasingly against King Charles I. However, this opposition could not be channeled into any meaningful change due to the irregular and infrequent intervals in which Parliament convened. Nevertheless, this state of affairs would soon change due to growing unrest to the north in Scotland, where the meddling of one Archbishop Laud was about to trigger a war. Scotland's decentralised and radically Protestant church, known as the Presbyterian Church, had deeply ingrained roots in the country's lowlands and parts of the Highlands. The Scots held on to their native faith lovingly, so when Charles and his administration tried to impose the Anglican Book of Common Prayer on them by royal decree, England's northern neighbour began to implode. Nationalist sentiment was stoked among all the classes, all the way from leading Scottish nobles down to the servant girls, one of whom notoriously threw a stool at the minister in St Giles Cathedral in Edinburgh when he attempted to read from the Anglican book. An organised response came on February 29, 1638, when Scottish lords signed the National Covenant, a pledge to uphold the native Scottish religion at all costs. This covenant pledged loyalty to the king, but on the condition that the Presbyterian Church was maintained in its unmolested form. This covenant circled around Scotland and gained rapturous support on all fronts, with its adherents becoming known as Covenanters. Over the next year, attempts at a negotiated solution failed, and war became inevitable. As a result, both sides began to raise their armies, the highly motivated Scots more quickly than the English, many of whom were actually sympathetic to the Scottish cause. Critically, this war footing began to push Charles's finances to the breaking point. To further compound matters, many of his aristocratic financiers were Catholic. The First Bishops' War of 1639 was short and inconclusive, ending with the pacification of Berwick, which both sides realised would not put an end to the conflict. So, both the Scots and the English began preparing for its resumption. However, Charles's war chest had run dry, and with all his sources of finance dried up, he was forced on April 13th to summon what would become known as the Short Parliament, the first in 11 years. After just 3 weeks of subsequent stalemate and frustration on both sides, the king dissolved Parliament again on May 5, 1640. Charles then immediately resumed collection of the hated ship money in order to fund his war. The Second Bishops' War of 1640 was a complete disaster for the king. A Scottish army of 20,000 Covenanters, led by the highly competent Earl of Leven, managed to outmaneuver the English, and not long after defeated them at the Battle of Newburn. Following what was the first Scottish victory on English soil since 1388, Leven occupied northeastern England. As a note, the Earl of Leven, also known as Alexander Leslie, had spent the previous decade fighting in the 30 Years' War in the service of Sweden's Gustavus Adolphus. We've previously covered his contribution to the Siege of Stralsund. To end this disastrous conflict, Charles signed the Treaty of Ripon, the terms of which required that the king pay the Scots £850 per day to maintain their occupation. Now burdened by this new financial drain, in addition to his own army, Charles was once again forced to call a parliament. Holding its first session on November 3, 1640, this would become known as the Long Parliament, because it would not be formally dissolved until March 1660. This time, Parliament was almost totally united against the king, and its more radical Puritan elements, led by the Earl of Warwick, began to dominate affairs. His radical allies tried and executed the Earl of Strafford, Charles's chief minister, began lengthy legal proceedings against Archbishop Laud, and secured other unprecedented concessions from the crown. All of these demands and more were set out in the Grand Remonstrance, a document of grievances and conditions, the most crucial of which would have deprived the king of many traditionally royal rights and privileges. It didn't seem that Charles was going to accept any further restriction of his power anyway, but an external factor now intervened and made everything that much worse. In October of 1641, a Catholic revolt led by Philip O'Neill of Kinnaird erupted in Ireland. Thousands of Protestants were already dead, and many more were refugees. It was clear that an army would be necessary to quell the Irish. But under whose authority could the army be raised? Parliament no longer trusted the king with military force, fearing that he would use the army against them, while the king would not accept Parliament's control because of the same reason. For some reason, perhaps because Charles had uncovered evidence that his enemies in Parliament had been conspiring with the Covenanters, Charles marched to the House of Commons with 400 soldiers on January 5, 1642. There, he attempted to arrest 5 MPs, John Pym, John Hampden, Arthur Hazelrig, Denzil Halls, and William Strode, the ostensible ringleaders of this imagined Covenanter conspiracy. When this attempt embarrassingly failed, the royal family quickly left London and went to Windsor Castle, fearing that the Parliament-supporting London mobs would be riled into a fury against them. From this point forward, King Charles and his opponents at Westminster edged slowly closer to civil war, with each side unwilling to blink, and both sides hoping that the other would do so first. Charles was able to convince many of his English and Welsh subjects that he stood for the defence of their traditional constitution and Elizabethan church doctrine, while Parliament argued that the king ought to be deprived of his remaining constitutional powers, as it was clear that he could not be trusted to use them. This too attracted many supporters, as did the widespread Puritan desire in Parliament to undertake radical religious reform. In the end, both sides attracted enough support to take the final step towards civil war. By early 1642, Charles had moved his court north to the city of York. Attempting to seize control of the situation in Ireland and assume military authority of their own, Parliament unconstitutionally issued the Militia Ordinance in March 1642, permitting them to raise an army and appoint its commanders. They chose the staunch anti-royalist Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, whose father had been executed after an attempted coup against Elizabeth I. Now requiring an army of his own to counter that of his enemies at Westminster, Charles passed the equally unconstitutional Commission of Array, allowing the king's chosen commissioners, usually local nobles, to levy troops from their own regions for service in the royal army. As the twin armies slowly began to grow, Charles marched from his base at York to the armoury city of Hull, arriving outside its gates on April 29th. The city contained a vast amount of arms and ammunition, enough to supply the royalist army's coming campaign if it became necessary. As it turned out, Charles was out of luck. Hull's governor, Sir John Hotham, had flipped to the parliamentary cause and barred the gates to the king, forcing His Majesty to retreat in humiliation, eventually ending up in Nottingham. It was there that on August 22, 1642, the king officially raised his royal standard on Castle Hill. In what was thought by many to be an ill omen for the coming clash, a storm blew the banner down the following night. The campaign began slowly. On September 9th, Parliament's appointed commander, Essex, established a headquarters at Northampton, with the aim of intercepting Charles's army with his own, and preventing any royalist march on London. The king, meanwhile, was still in a bit of a shaky situation. With only 5 regiments of foot and 500 cavalry troopers by this time, the king's army needed more men. In order to get them, Charles departed from Nottingham September 13th and marched west through Derby, Uttoxeter, Stafford and Wellington, eventually reaching Shrewsbury on the 20th. This position allowed the Royalists to absorb more units Charles's commissioners had raised in North Wales and Lancashire, swelling his army to a workable size. While this was happening, the Royalist horse, under the experienced command of Prince Rupert, took up position in Bridgnorth, aiming to screen any potential parliamentary attack on the main army. Prince Rupert was the son of Frederick V, Elector of the Palatinate, who had failed to gain the throne of Bohemia in 1618, essentially beginning the 30 Years' War. After being captured by the Holy Roman Empire in a military campaign, Rupert had been freed by the diplomatic maneuvering of his uncle, Charles I. He subsequently came over to England and gratefully joined the English king's army as an extremely competent cavalry commander. Essex subsequently attempted to prevent a royalist thrust towards London and deter further royalist reinforcements by marching towards Worcester. While the bulk of Parliament's field army was ponderously making its way through the scattered villages of the Midlands, Essex sent 2 cavalry regiments ahead to secure the west bank of the River Severn. However, when around 1,000 parliamentary horsemen ran into a similar number of Rupert's royalist horsemen at Powick Bridge, the former were quickly routed and driven off by the prince's superior tactics. This was the first true engagement of the Civil War, and was, according to parliamentarian Hugh Peters, where England's sorrows began. Buoyed by this initial victory, the now enlarged Royalist army began to move out of Shrewsbury on October 12th, with London as its ultimate objective. Charles would march on the Viper's Nest and end the war here and now. A week later, Essex began his eastward march in pursuit, eventually arriving in the vicinity of Kyneton with the aim of protecting Banbury, while Charles and his army were conducting operations from the nearby town of Edgecote. Because of the two sides' inexperience in war, insufficient scouting had not alerted either side to the presence of the other so close by. A Royalist Council of War at Edgecote, held on the 22nd, decided that a 4,000-strong brigade would attempt to seize Banbury the next day. By nightfall, the King's army was dispersing into billets around the Wormington Hills, while at the same time, Essex's army finally arrived at Kyneton. While Charles was staying at the home of Sir William Chansey, Prince Rupert rode to Wormleighton, and seemingly by chance, managed to capture a quartermaster's party from Essex's army, which was nearby. After prying information from the prisoners, Rupert sent a few mounted scouts to Kyneton, who returned at midnight and confirmed that the entire parliamentary army was right there. By 3 AM on the 23rd of October, Charles was aware that Essex was in the area, and an hour later, exhausted officers began to dispatch orders to their men for a general rendezvous near the Edgehill Heights. At this point, the King's Royalist army was between Essex and London, meaning that it could have marched towards London relatively unopposed. However, Charles and his advisors would not back away from the clash, and decided to do a 180, finally meeting the Roundhead army near Edgehill, 3 miles southeast of Kyneton. By the afternoon of October 23rd, the armies of Parliament and King now faced each other across a section of arable land and meadow just northwest of the main slopes. To all those present on both sides, it seemed as though the decisive battle of the war was at hand. With its battle array formed on the level ground just in front of Radway, Charles I's Royalists arrayed their army in 2 lines of battle, opting to deploy in the Swedish-style checkerboard formation, rather than in the Dutch style, which would allow the second-line regiments to form a continuous front if needed. Infantry brigades in the first line, from left to right, were led by Henry Wentworth, Richard Fielding and Charles Gerard, while those to the rear were led by Sir Nicholas Byron and John Bellasis. All appear to have been about the same size, for a total infantry force of just over 9,000 men. Opposite them were Essex's infantry, formed up into 3 large but loosely formed brigades of roughly 4,000 men each for a total of 12,000 foot. The central brigade took up a mainly defensive position behind a small hill, while the 2 on the flanks were slightly in front. Most of the cavalry on both sides of the battlefield was present on Prince Rupert's royalist right wing. He held overall command on this flank, had a unit of 1,000 dragoons, and was opposed by James Ramsay's parliamentary cavalry. Also on this side of the battlefield was a unit of parliamentary dragoon mobile infantry and musketeers hidden to ambush in a nearby hedgerow. On the other flank, slightly less numerous royalist cavalry under Henry Wilmot faced those commanded by the Duke of Bedford. It's said that King Charles visited every unit of his cavalry and all of his infantry formations in order to review his troops and encourage them for the coming battle. He even wished to ride with his army, but was persuaded to retire to the rear with his small lifeguard cavalry reserve, the majority of which had persuaded the king to let them join Rupert's charge. The first major battle of the English Civil War finally began at 2 p.m. with an artillery duel. Lasting for 1 hour, neither bombardment inflicted heavy losses and served more as a loud prelude to the real battle. While this was going on, dragoons on Rupert's extreme right wing were able to discover and eventually repel the Roundhead ambushers within the hedgerow, providing the main cavalry force with a free run at the enemy. With Essex's army unwilling to move first, fighting began when both of the royalist cavalry wings launched a thunderous head-on charge at their opposition. Using the latest cavalry shock tactics of direct charge imported from the continent by Prince Rupert, the king's horsemen on both flanks swept away Parliament's cavalry, which still used stationary Dutch tactics of firing from saddleback. A unit of parliamentarian troopers even deserted and joined the royalists. With both of Essex's mounted wings swept off the field, it seemed like the time was right for the king's horse to pivot and launch the coup de grace against Parliament's flank and rear. However, due to the indiscipline of its commanders and individual soldiers, who were flushed with the glory of victory, they instead continued chasing the routed enemy. Historians believe that if the royalist cavalry had halted, regrouped and charged at this point, the English Civil War could have been put to a decisive end, but it was not to be, and the opportunity was lost. With almost all horsemen now off the field, both infantry forces filed into a single line of battle and prepared to advance. Musketeers blasted away and softened up the opposing foot, before the pikemen, wielding their 16-foot-long weapons, came into contact and engaged in a so-called push of pike, a shoving match during which the two sides literally pushed each other until one broke. Better equipped parliamentary footmen managed to gain a slight advantage, and casualties slowly began to mount on both sides. Now that all of the royalist cavalry had victoriously left the field, 2 parliamentary reserve cavalry units under Sir William Balfour and Philip Stapleton, which had previously been hidden behind a small hill, struck the flanks of Byron's unit. After subsequently bursting through the royalist centre, Balfour managed to disable a few of the enemy's artillery pieces. Without knowing it, they had also come extremely close to capturing the king's sons, Charles and his brother James. In the midst of the fighting, the king's royal standard was seized by the parliamentary infantry, but was then recaptured by a royalist cavalry officer. By late afternoon, inexperienced soldiers on both sides were shaken by the experience of battle, and by dusk, Rupert's cavalry returned and stabilized the situation. Neither side had any further stomach for the battle, and both backed off at nightfall. By the time morning came, the royalists had retreated from the field, and the battle ended as a stalemate. The 1,500 dead soldiers was a small casualty count when compared to the horrors on the continent, primarily due to the terribly cold night which followed the battle at Edgehill, which helped to seal the fate of many injured troops. After the brutal and inconclusive Battle of Edgehill, the Earl of Essex's battered and demoralised parliamentary army retreated north to the safety of Warwick Castle. Meanwhile, jubilant at the news of his army's victory, and urged by his firebrand cavalry commander Prince Rupert, King Charles I ordered a measured advance towards London. He advanced via Banbury, which capitulated on October 26th, then took Oxford, the city which would become the Royalist cause's beating heart throughout the First War. While the main armies of both factions thrust and parried each other's blows near England's great capital city, the embers of conflict also burst into flames in the outlying counties. In the north, the Earl of Newcastle, Charles's appointed military governor in the region, assembled a small but disciplined army and faced off against the parliamentarian Lord Fairfax and his prodigious son and second-in-command Sir Thomas. Throughout the course of 1642, Newcastle gradually gained the upper hand in Yorkshire, pushing the anti-Cavalier forces back to Selby. He enjoyed such success that in December, the Earl even received royal thanks for his service. In the West Country, Royalist and parliamentary forces fought a small-scale war of raids and counter-raids near the Welsh border, a state of affairs that would continue well into 1643. In this theatre too, the king's men gained the upper hand. As the war on the periphery continued, the king's main army resumed its march on London after stopping at Reading to consolidate. However, this delay allowed Essex to overtake his opponent by moving via Northampton, reaching London before the Royalists got there. The armies clashed again on November 11th, when Royalist troops under Rupert caught and badly mauled 2 regiments of Parliamentary Horse near Brentford, a key staging point on the way to London. Much like they had at Edgehill, the Prince's victorious troops went too far instead of consolidating their position. This time, rather than simply taking Brentford as a prelude to moving on to London, his men looted it. While this plundering was gentle when compared to the ravages of the 30 Years' War on the continent, inhabitants of nearby towns began forming into a citizens' army, prepared to resist further attacks. When the Royalists approached the village of Turnham Green, only a few miles from London, they were opposed by a ragtag army of 24,000 parliamentarians, composed of men from the capital's trained bands, Essex's beaten army, and hastily armed civilians. Against this defensive bulwark, there was nothing Charles's army could do. The Royalist host was already short of supplies, and still depleted in numbers after Edgehill, and moreover, if the apparently imminent Battle of Turnham Green became a true battle, the killing of London's ordinary people, however armed they were, would likely turn the country against its king even more. So, after an incredibly tense standoff lasting almost all day, the Royalist army turned and withdrew at dusk. This was a pivotal moment in the war, for the Royalists had failed to retake the city, and its massive wealth, industry, ports, and strategic value would remain a keystone of parliamentarian power. After this anticlimax, Charles dispersed his army to winter quarters in Oxford and the surrounding towns, where support for the king was most pronounced. Over that winter, the famous university city was transformed into an alternative military capital for the Royalist cause. While the king's army put down roots for the cold season, Essex's still numerically superior force concluded the year by besieging and capturing Reading. After this, with disease and many other issues plaguing both armies, a stalemate set in. Essex wintered in the Thames Valley, where his army was dormant until the campaigning season of the next year. To further protect the capital, civilians began digging earthworks and other defences. By the turn of 1643, it was clear that any chance of a quick Cavalier victory had been snuffed out. On January 23, 1643, a parliamentarian force under Sir Thomas Fairfax stormed a 1,500-strong Royalist garrison at Leeds under Sir William Savile. After a swift 2-hour battle, the Royalists were defeated, the survivors withdrawing to Wakefield in the evening. The sullen appearance of Leeds's beaten and downtrodden royalists spooked Wakefield's own garrison, and by nightfall this town too was abandoned. The next day, Fairfax's men occupied Wakefield. With Leeds and Wakefield taken, a line of communications had been opened between Sir Thomas and his father. Sir Thomas would remain at Riding until the end of March, when he was recalled to Selby. Meanwhile, Newcastle and his forces returned to York. Here, his command was faced with two tasks before he could return his attention to Lord Fairfax. First, he sent General James King with a detachment of horse troops to escort an ammunition convoy from Newcastle to York. On February 1st, the convoy was ambushed by a sallying force from the Scarborough garrison, led by the city's parliamentarian governor, Sir Hugh Cholmondeley, at Yarram Bridge. Although Cholmondeley's force held the advantage of good terrain, they were beaten back from the field. Soon after, Cholmondeley would defect, declaring his allegiance to King Charles and transferring much of the East Riding of Yorkshire to Royalist control. The immediate concern for Charles was a lack of military resources, particularly gunpowder and match. His wife, Henrietta Maria, was in the process of ferrying hundreds of barrels of these, other supplies and money to Oxford from the Low Countries. However, until he received these critical munitions, the main Royalist army was unable to undertake any proper offensives. Failure to capture any of the major port towns of the south meant that the Queen's convoy had to dock at the northern coastal town of Bridlington, which was under Newcastle's control at the time. For the time being, a wedge of parliamentarian-held territory sat between the king and his much-needed supplies, a fact which made the Yorkshire campaign of 1643 even more vital. While the Queen took residence in York, Newcastle fought the two Fairfaxes for supremacy over Yorkshire's valuable clothing towns. In an early spring campaign, it seemed as though the Royalists were going to maintain their hegemony in the north. Lord Fairfax found himself in a precarious situation at Selby, having little support. With Newcastle's main army at York and the defected Cholmondeley holding much of the East Riding, Fairfax's power now lay solely in the West Riding. Sir Thomas Fairfax was ordered to bring what men he could to join him at Sherburn, as Newcastle's forces were in a good position to intercept them on their way to Leeds. Sir Thomas soon returned from the West Riding, bringing a small force of musketeers and horses, supplemented with a large body of clubmen, local volunteers armed with whatever weapons they could find. Sir Thomas was given the task of creating a diversion for his father's march by engaging the small Royalist garrison at Tadcaster. During the march, his troops passed through the old medieval battlefield of Towton before making their way to Tadcaster's outskirts. The Royalist garrison of 3,000 to 4,000 men, seeing Sir Thomas's large host approaching, promptly abandoned the town to the Roundheads. Newcastle had planned to send a large horse contingent to intercept Lord Fairfax's march, but with Tadcaster fallen, he feared his intelligence reports were off, and that rather than advancing to Leeds, Lord Fairfax was actually moving against him at York. Having this train of thought in mind, Newcastle deployed his army in an order of battle on Clifton Moor. The diversion by Sir Thomas's command had played out perfectly, causing the Royalists to question their enemy's movements and intentions. However, finding Tadcaster abandoned, Sir Thomas opted to destroy the enemy earthworks in the town, causing much delay, while a sizable contingent of Royalists crossed the River Wharfe at Thorpe Arch, just north of Tadcaster, and was advancing rapidly on his position. The Royalists were led by Colonel George Goring, who was a capable yet often erratic cavalier. Sir Thomas's force marching against the Royalists was slightly larger than Goring's, but Sir Thomas only had 150 horsemen, compared to Goring's complement of around 1,000 horsemen and dragoons. The remainder of the parliamentarian command consisted of foot, musketeers and clubmen. Sir Thomas was faced with a difficult task, withdrawing in the face of an enemy numerically superior in horsemen across two large areas of open ground, Bramham Moor and Winmore. The area of Winmore, closest to Seacroft village, was known locally as Seacroft Moor. The Roundheads began their march onto Bramham Moor with the Royalist horse hot in pursuit. Offsetting his numerical inferiority by utilising country lanes, Fairfax intended to bottle up the Royalists long enough for his foot units to reach the enclosures between Bramham Moor and Winmore. Continuing his steady withdrawal until his foot had enough time to cross Bramham Moor, Sir Thomas was outraged to find that his foot troops had not moved an inch from their positions. With the Royalists fast approaching, Sir Thomas opted to divide his foot companies into 2 divisions, sending them across the moor, protecting their rear with 3 troops of horse. By now, the Royalists had deployed on the moor in 3 equal contingents, and were continuing to shadow the Roundheads' withdrawal, maintaining several hundred yards distance. Before long, Sir Thomas's forces reached the enclosures between Bramham Moor and Winmore, but the situation rapidly deteriorated when the men reached the town of Kidhall. Here, the men broke ranks to seek a drink on that hot day, and the Parliamentarian forces' cohesion became disrupted. A crisis point was being reached in the battle. When Sir Thomas's column emerged from the enclosures onto the moor, Goring's men were shadowing them a few hundred yards to the north. Before the Parliamentarians could manage to reach the safety of Seacroft village, Goring turned his men into battle lines and charged the disrupted Roundhead ranks. 1,000 horsemen bore down on Sir Thomas's men, who stood little chance in their exposed and greatly disordered columns. The Parliamentarians, greatly pressed by the Royalist horse, soon fell into panic and disarray. The militia clubmen fled almost immediately, while the remaining companies of foot and musketeers put up a slightly better defence. But when the infantry discharged their muskets, they found themselves defenceless against the Royalist horsemen. Heavily outnumbered, Sir Thomas's mounted troops decided to abandon their comrades in the foot companies to their fate. Most of the Roundhead horsemen managed to retreat, but few of the foot companies and musketeers could escape their current predicament. The Parliamentarians had been well and truly beaten at the Battle of Seacroft Moor. Over 800 prisoners were taken, along with about 100 to 200 men killed. Sir Thomas Fairfax would describe the battle as the greatest loss we ever received. On March 30th, one of Newcastle's subordinates, George Goring, soundly defeated the Northern Parliamentarians at Seacroft Moor near Leeds. Unwilling to be defeated so easily, the Fairfaxes got back at him in May. On the night of the 21st, Sir Thomas Fairfax stormed Wakefield in an excellently executed night assault and captured Goring in the process. The setback was a shock to Newcastle and meant that the Yorkshire Royalists were unable to spare any troops to assist their Queen's progress back to Oxford. A few weeks earlier, Essex had roused Parliament's main army in the Thames Valley and used it to besiege Reading, a vital link in the defensive line shielding Charles's makeshift capital at Oxford. Essex took the city on April 25th after a blockade lasting almost 2 weeks. Unfortunately for the Lord General, his overly cautious nature and a massive outbreak of typhus among his soldiers crippled the Roundhead army, threw away its strategic initiative, and gave Royalist forces in the area much needed breathing room. On June 1st, Henrietta Maria left York, accompanied by 5,000 men, and despite being clearly sighted by Essex's scouts, was not intercepted. As the supply convoy slowly moved south, the northern campaign reached a climax when Newcastle's 10,000 men cornered and crushed Thomas Fairfax's 3,500 at Old Walton Moor, securing Royalist control over Yorkshire and besieging the Parliamentarians at Hull. Now free of pressure from the Thames Valley, Prince Rupert, victorious in many small raids and cavalry skirmishes, rode north to escort his queen the rest of the way. She finally entered Oxford on July 14th to rapturous applause and the ringing of bells. Everything was going the king's way, but the Royalist summer hadn't peaked just yet. The main threat to Oxford in 1643 was Sir William Waller's newly formed Western Association Army, operating in and around the area of modern Wiltshire and the southwest, threatening to cut off Royalist communication with Wales, a key recruiting ground. He was opposed in the west by the brilliant Royalist commander Sir Ralph Hopton, an old friend and comrade of Waller's with whom he had fought in the 30 Years' War decades earlier. He was also a notorious disciplinarian, touting the firm but fair motto, "Pay well, command well, hang well." If there was any chance of an eastward link-up between Hopton's Royalist army and Charles's force in Oxford for a combined offensive on London, parliamentarian control in the west first had to be crushed. Back on May 16th, Hopton had defeated the Roundheads at the Battle of Stratton in Cornwall, and his rapid progress into Devon had encouraged the king to send him reinforcements under Prince Maurice and the Marquis of Hertford. On June 4th, Hopton's army was reinforced at Chard, bringing his combined strength up to 4,000 foot, 2,000 horsemen, and 300 dragoons, as well as 16 cannon. In the ensuing campaign, Hopton, Hertford, and Prince Maurice would share equal command over their army, combining their dignity, rank, and military skills to form an effectively led fighting force. Hertford commanded in name through his social status, while Hopton led in the field, and Prince Maurice oversaw the army's horse contingent. The Royalists' plan for the summer campaign in the west relied on the construction of a stout defensible base of operations by seizing Wells, Taunton, Bridgewater, and Dunster Castle before applying pressure against the parliamentarians' main rallying point at Bath. Cavalry raids and skirmishes erupted in the countryside between Royalists and parliamentarians as Hopton's army converged on its objectives. On June 9th, a large skirmish broke out south of Chewton Mendip, in which Prince Maurice was temporarily taken prisoner. A 3-week lull then ensued, during which Waller hoped to augment his army at Bath with additional reinforcements. The parliamentarian cavalry was bolstered by a regiment of cuirassiers arriving from London under Sir Arthur Heselrigge, bringing the parliamentarian cavalry strength up to 2,500. But Waller badly needed infantry. By the first week of July, Waller could field no more than 1,500 footmen against Hopton's 4,000. The Royalists entered Bradford-on-Avon on July 2nd, bringing them within 5 miles southeast of Bath. In response, Waller moved his army to Claverton Down to halt the enemy's advance. On the 3rd, Hopton's regiments began pushing back Waller's picket posts and other outlying detachments. With pressure bearing down on him from Prince Maurice, whose horse regiments attacked Claverton, and with Hopton's foot regiments pursuing Waller's troops through Bath Easton, the parliamentarians were forced to make a hasty withdrawal into Bath. At midnight, Hopton evaluated his situation and considered moving past Bath Easton to the southern slopes of Lansdowne Hill. However, having just a portion of the army at his disposal, Hopton decided to wait until Prince Maurice's horse regroups with him the next day. On the morning of July 4th, the Royalists closed in on Lansdowne, only to find that Waller's army had beaten them to it. Waller's army was strongly posted on the summit of Lansdowne Hill. Holding a council of war with his co-commanders, Hopton decided an attack on the position was beyond contemplation, but also to remain where they were would only incur further casualties. Just after midday, the Royalists pulled back to Marshfield, with Hopton covering their withdrawal. Waller knew that the Royalists would try to make a move to capture Bath from the north by advancing along the ridge of Lansdowne Hill. And so, just after dawn on July 5th, he manoeuvred his army along the Roman road which runs through Lansdowne and set up on the north escarpment in order to counter a Royalist advance from Marshfield. At the top of the hill, Waller instructed his foot companies to build crude breastworks astride the road ascending the hill, while simultaneously throwing out a cavalry screen to probe the Royalist picket outposts. Waller's horsemen soon located and engaged the Royalist outposts and began skirmishing with them, harrying them back onto the main Royalist body at Marshfield. Roused into action by this challenge, at 8 AM, Hopton deployed his army, setting it in motion towards Lansdowne Hill. He used Tog and Freezing Hills as the axis of his advance on the Roundhead lines. Skirmishing continued inconclusively around Tog Hill for another 2 hours, but Hopton and his co-commanders knew they would gain little from these small actions, besides exhausting their limited ammunition supply. At 10 that morning, the Royalists began to withdraw back to their camp at Marshfield to rethink their strategy. But before Hopton's army had moved even a mile, Waller sent out most of his horse and dragoon squadrons in pursuit. The timing of his attack was perfect. The Roundhead horsemen sent shockwaves of panic and confusion surging through the ranks of the Royalist rearguard. Only a stout defence by Hopton's Cornish foot regiments in the centre, and a timely intervention by Lord Carnarvon's regiment of horse prevented Hopton's withdrawal from turning into a complete rout. Gradually, more and more royalist units wheeled about and rushed to join in the action raging at Tog and Freezing Hills. Eventually, the parliamentarians were driven back after hours of bloody combat. The parliamentarian horse squadrons were steadily pressed back along Freezing Hill, and soon came under a galling enfilading fire from royalist cavalry and musketeers. The Roundhead ranks fell into a bout of confusion. However, the parliamentarians soon rallied and put up a stiff resistance of their own, slowing Hopton's progress. By the early afternoon, the royalists held firm control of the ground before Waller's position on Lansdowne Hill. Hopton, however, was still less than enthusiastic about launching what he saw would be a costly frontal assault on Waller's prepared position on the high ground atop the escarpment. As royalist troops waited for orders in the valley below, they came under an intense artillery barrage from the parliamentarian guns atop the hill. Hopton's Cornish foot regiments impatiently pleaded with Hopton to charge Waller's cannons. Finally relenting, Hopton ordered both his horse and foot regiments to storm the enemy position. The royalist horse charged up the centre through Freezing Hill Lane, as musketeers attempted to drive out the Roundheads from the woods on either side of the road. It was hoped that the infantry would then be in a position to outflank Waller's line. Unfortunately for Hopton, the royalist horse squadrons were repulsed in the centre with heavy losses, and it was only through Colonel Sir Bevil Grenville that they managed to maintain the attack's momentum. Spotting the royalist squadrons in the centre falling back in disarray, Grenville led his Cornish pikemen forward, advancing up the hill with musketeers supporting his left and cavalry holding the right. Their movement partially concealed by a wall on the left side of the road, the Cornish pikemen steadily pressed ahead to the top of the escarpment, where they came under murderous fire as they crested the hill. The advance came screeching to a halt, and Sir Arthur Heselridge's regiment of horse charged the stubborn Cornishmen 3 times as the royalists tried desperately to cling to their position on level ground. Grenville was killed, fighting at the head of his pikemen. For a decisive moment, Grenville's defence had broken the offensive spirit of the parliamentarian horse squadrons. Waller began pulling his men back to cover behind a stone wall, about 400 yards behind his breastworks. The royalists were now faced with the challenge of overcoming a second strong parliamentarian defensive line. The battle was grinding into a stalemate, as the exhausted royalists were unable to muster the strength to press onwards against a second enemy line of defence and be subjected to even more withering fire. The lull didn't last long, with Waller deciding to withdraw his army along Lansdowne Hill back towards Bath. The fatigued royalists, low on ammunition and unable to follow up their hours-long battle with a rigorous pursuit, allowed the parliamentarians to retreat before them. However, the wheel of fortune turned quickly. When the Cavalier commander inspected prisoners from the battle, he was injured by an exploding powder magazine and temporarily put out of action. Early the next morning, the royalists began withdrawing to Marshfield. The Battle of Lansdowne had ended in a major tactical royalist victory, with Hopton holding the field at the cost of around 200 to 300 men killed and another 600 to 700 wounded. However, Waller believed that Lansdowne was a strategic victory for the parliamentarian cause. Although Waller had retreated in good order and given up the field to Hopton, he had suffered relatively light casualties. The royalists had been stopped in their attempt to capture Bath, and they had now become more concerned with safely withdrawing their army intact rather than conquering the parliamentarian stronghold. After then, receiving reinforcements from Oxford, Charles's armies concluded affairs in the west at the conclusive Battle of Roundway Down. Once again, the royalist advantage in horsemen paid off, and their mounted charge shattered the parliamentary line. Many terrified and fleeing Roundhead cavalry charged by accident down a hidden 300-foot drop, known since as the Bloody Ditch. With that, the Western Association army was utterly crushed. When news subsequently arrived in Oxford that their enemy's Western army had been totally annihilated, Charles dispatched Prince Rupert with 5,500 troops to reinforce Hopton's army. This opportunistic campaign probably intended to take Gloucester, but Waller's retreat to the city bolstered its defences, making that objective unrealistic. So instead, the Royalist field army headed for Bristol, England's second most populated city. It also possessed key metalworking industries, which could be turned to the creation of weaponry, and a small fleet which had potential as the beginnings of a reborn navy. Rupert, whose very name was half a conquest, reached Bristol unopposed on July 23rd. That day, the prince quartered himself at Westbury College, 2 miles short of Bristol. During the afternoon, he led a reconnaissance party along the Avon from Durham Down to Clifton Church in order to scout out the western defences of the city. Parliamentarian forces in the nearby Brandon Hill Fort soon opened fire on Rupert's party. Opting to return to his camp to begin making siege preparations, Rupert left a contingent of 200 musketeers, 100 pikemen, and a regiment of dragoons under Colonel Henry Washington at Clifton Church. During the night, Washington's party sallied out from Clifton Church and engaged the Roundheads at Brandon Hill Fort, but were repulsed. More skirmishing across the lines continued throughout the day. Meanwhile, to the south of the River Avon, Prince Maurice's Cornish army began digging entrenchments in preparation for the siege. Cannons were brought up from the rear to form siege batteries. On July 24th, Prince Rupert demonstrated in front of the defences of Bristol, sending an officer and trumpeter to the city walls with a message for Colonel Nathaniel Fiennes, commanding the Bristol garrison. Rupert ordered Fiennes and his men to stand down, but the colonel refused. Rupert crossed the Avon with his retinue the next day to meet with Prince Maurice in a council of war to determine how best to take Bristol. The main question was how best to take the city, by a slow, methodical siege or with a direct assault on the works. Prince Maurice and many of his officers in the Western Army implored Rupert to commence a traditional siege operation, but Rupert and his officers favoured an immediate assault on the position. Eventually, Rupert won out, and the stage was set for an assault on Bristol the next day. The plan for the storming of Bristol called for an assault to be made at daybreak. In order to identify friends from foes between the two armies in the confusion of battle, the password Oxford was given out to the Royalist ranks, and every soldier was to wear a green emblem or article of clothing. Prince Maurice's Cornish footmen were formed into 3 columns, with the intent of storming the walls on either side of the Temple Gate. The plan called for a signal shot to be fired by the various siege batteries at 4 a.m. At 3 o'clock on the morning of July 26th, however, the impatient Cornish foot columns began setting off for the attack. Seeing this, Prince Rupert ordered the signal guns to open fire, commencing the general assault. On the northeast side of the city, a brigade under Lord Ganderson assaulted Stokes Croft and Priors Hill Fort, but they were repulsed with high losses, and Lord Ganderson was mortally wounded. More bad news soon arrived when a small bomb placed on the gate at Stokes Croft failed to explode. Colonel John Bellassis's brigade assaulted the Windmill Hill Fort, but without scaling ladders they could not climb over the walls and fill the ditches with fascists. Seeing the brigade retreating in disorder, Prince Rupert personally rode out to rally the regiments, bringing them back up to the line for a renewed attack on Windmill Hill, but they were still unable to gain headway. Colonel Henry Wentworth led his brigade into a hail of withering fire at the Windmill Hill Fort and was soon repulsed. To the right of Wentworth's brigade, Colonel Washington and his dragoons were able to reach an angle in the wall out of sight of the main fort's enfilading fire. Wentworth's men soon followed Washington's lead. The Royalist column threw their grenades over the fort walls and stormed the parapet. Heavy fighting erupted inside the fort, and the Royalist infantry tore down the walls to allow for the horse squadrons to follow them in. The Roundheads here, led by Major Hercules Langrish, were unable to stem the onrushing Royalist tide, and were soon falling back. Colonel Fiennes's regiment of horse attempted to counterattack, and an intense melee raged around the Windmill Hill Fort until the parliamentarians were forced back and driven into the city suburbs. Seizing the momentum of the attack, Wentworth's brigade took a fortified position known as the Essex Work, its Roundhead garrison having abandoned it after spotting the approaching Royalist foot. Back to the south of Bristol, the Cornish attack continued pressing on toward the wall, pushing carts into the moat to use as a makeshift fasci. the Cornish foot suffered especially heavy casualties attempting to scale the city walls, with many senior officers being killed or wounded. Colonel Brutus Buck, at the head of his column, managed to escape the ramparts before he received a blow from a halberd which knocked him back into the ditch and fatally wounded him. Sir Nicholas Slanning and Colonel John Trevanion were shot dead, and many other senior field officers were badly wounded. To the north, Wentworth's brigade was joined by Bellasy's, and their 2 units pushed onward against the city defences, supported by Major General Sir Arthur Aston's horse detachment. The Royalists were soon upon the inner fortifications of Bristol, with combat focusing around the Froome Gate. The Cavaliers tried desperately to force it open against determined Roundhead resistance. Among the parliamentary defenders at the Froome Gate was a group of women led by Dorothy Hazard. These women vigorously worked to reinforce the gate with woolsacks and earth to keep the Royalists out. Rupert sent a message to Maurice asking for 1,000 Cornish foot to reinforce the assault on the Froome Gate. As these troops made their way around the walls at 2 p.m, Colonel Fiennes opened up a parley talk with Prince Rupert, seeking terms to open the city to the Royalists. Rupert immediately took up Fiennes's offer of parley, hoping to avoid even greater losses with a renewed assault. Meeting with Rupert, Fiennes came to an agreement to surrender Bristol at 10 p.m. that night, by which time the Royalists held much of the city anyway. The parliamentary garrison, under the terms of the Articles of War, were allowed to march out of Bristol, with the officers and cavalry allowed to keep their horses and swords, and all ranks were permitted to keep their personal belongings. However, the terms of the surrender agreement were soon broken, and the Roundheads soon found their belongings ransacked and plundered, stripped of all they could carry by the victorious Royalist troops as they departed Bristol. 3 days later, his forces stormed the city's outer defences and managed to capture one of its gates. Realising his cause was hopeless, Parliamentary Governor Nathaniel Fiennes surrendered soon after. The capitulation was a coup for the Royalist forces in both morale and material. Around 80 guns were seized, along with 1,700 barrels of gunpowder and 6,000 muskets. But the manpower cost had been a high one. As many as 500 Royalists were killed in the attack. With the gathered momentum, a Royalist War Council convened on August 4th and agreed that the next target would be Gloucester itself. With a population of 5,000, it controlled the Severn River and communications from Oxford to South Wales. By the 10th, Royalist armies completely surrounded the city, but instead of the surrender of its governor, Edward Massey, they were met with fierce resistance. Now facing an extensive siege, Charles's siege commander, the Earl of Forth, began a bombardment on the 13th. When news arrived of Gloucester's situation, total alarm struck Parliament due to fear that its loss might mean total collapse. To remedy the situation, Essex's main army near London was swiftly reinforced with an influx of fresh troops and the trained bands of the city proper. At about this time, Edward Montague, Earl of Manchester, was given command of the newly formed Eastern Association Parliamentarian Army. He appointed an almost unknown cavalry commander, a certain Oliver Cromwell, as his second in command. On August 25th, Essex's enlarged main army managed to save the beleaguered parliamentarian bastion in the west. Despite suffering multiple Royalist attempts to hinder his army's progress, Essex reached Prestbury Hill, from which he could see the spires of Gloucester's great cathedral on September 5th. From there, the Thames army fired off a number of cannons to alert the city garrison that relief was close at hand. On the same day, Charles's almost month-long investment of Gloucester came to an end with total failure, his army withdrawing to Bristol. Nevertheless, Essex's now vulnerable position provided the Royalists with a great opportunity to win the war anyway. The presence of London's trained bands in the field army meant that if the Cavaliers could bring Essex to battle and defeat him, a significant part of the capital's defenders would be lost with the army's destruction. Realizing the danger, the Lord General tried to trick his Cavalier opponents by moving up to Tewkesbury, feinting as if he was either going to march in a wide arc back to London using the northern route, or intended to invade Wales. When his ruse failed, Essex boldly made a run for safety via the southern route on September 15th. He almost succeeded, but Prince Rupert's scouts detected the movement, caught up with the parliamentarians via a more direct route, and savaged their dangerously overextended army at Oldbourne Chase. This forced Essex to delay his march, and allowed Charles's army to overtake his own. The Royalists occupied the town of Newbury on the gloomy afternoon of September 19th, thereby putting themselves in a superior position between London and Essex, forcing the latter to rest on high ground south of Enbourne village. Defying his usually cautious nature and unwilling to stay on the back foot, the Earl of Essex roused his army, composed of 8,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry, just before dawn. The general rallied his vanguard, asked whether they were willing to fight, and was met with the reply, "Let us fall upon them. We will, by God's assistance, beat it from them all." With that, Essex led his vanguard of 4,000 infantry and a small number of mounted men out at 6 AM, towards the strategic height of Round Hill. The Royalist forces hadn't properly reconnoitred the battlefield, and thus hadn't realised the escarpment's importance. So with relative ease, the parliamentarians took the defensible position. The Cavalier army, made up of 7,000 infantry and a formidable 7,500 cavalry, began filing out of Newbury a few hours after the parliamentarians assembled. While the main force organised itself, the energetic Prince Rupert rode out with 900 musketeers and some cavalry to take Round Hill himself. However, he was shocked to discover that the strategic high point was strongly defended by around 2,500 parliamentarian soldiers, whose presence blocked the Royalists. Realising he couldn't make progress with his current strength, Rupert left the infantry under Colonel George Lissell and rode back to Newbury. News of Round Hill's capture by the Roundheads alarmed the Cavalier leadership, but a swiftly organised war council quickly decided what the objectives and deployment for the day would be. With their plans finalised, Charles I's Royalist army began deploying on a north-south axis in 3 main sections. A relatively small number of troops, under William Vavasour's overall command, were stationed on the right wing, in the enclosed Kennet River Valley. In the centre, attacking Round Hill, were placed Sir Nicholas and John Byron. Prince Rupert and the majority of Royalist cavalry arrayed on an open area called Wash Common on the left, closer to the Enbourne River. England's second Stuart king raised his royal banner on a hill in the northern Kennet Valley area of the battlefield. It was on this front that the day's first action took place, provoked by parliamentarian artillery fire raining down from Round Hill. Vavasour's royal regiments advanced in the valley's enclosed terrain and amidst dense hedgerows, moving forward on land which was far better suited for defence rather than attack. After a brief, terse clash on this northern flank, the Royalist foot was easily blunted, with heavy losses. However, sensing an opportunity, the triumphant parliamentarian foot launched an attack of their own. This thrust gained some ground, and managed to unbalance Vavasour's ranks, but the intervention of Charles's Lifeguard cavalry blocked it. For the remainder of September 20th, both sides avoided closing with one another on the northern front. On the approaches to Round Hill, the 2 Byrons and their respective infantry and cavalry units advanced up the slope in an attempt to dislodge the parliamentarians on top. However, their march was spotted, and they were met with fierce resistance from ranks of musketeers and emplaced culverins. During the vicious fighting which broke out on the hill, an intellectual and anti-war aristocrat known as Lord Falkland, who fought for the Royalists, was killed by a musket ball. Soon after, Cavalier horsemen managed to rout a section of the parliamentarian centre and were close to securing Round Hill. However, professional officers in Essex's reserve saw the danger, plugged the gap, and used disciplined volley fire from muskets to repel the horsemen. The king's forces were stuck in a stalemate here as well. As brutal close-quarters fighting was taking place on Round Hill, Prince Rupert was busy organising 6,000 Royalist horses on Wash Common. When the first line of cavalry was ready, it charged into Sir Philip Stapleton's parliamentarian horse, who hadn't fully formed up on the opposite side of the common. Stapleton managed to put together a defence in time, using new delayed close-range volley tactics to drive the Royalist cavalry back twice. However, amidst the crack of carbines and clang of poleaxes on plate, Prince Rupert managed to turn the Parliamentarian cavalry's flank on the third charge, driving them back to Skinner's Green Lane. In the afternoon, reserve units of the London-trained bands strode into the breach on Wash Common left by the cavalry, repulsing a probing charge by Rupert's horse. Instead, the Royalists resorted to a massive artillery barrage aimed at breaking the final Parliamentarian ranks. However, the supposedly inferior trained bands, who had no cover on the open plain, defied all expectations and stood stalwartly, maintaining their formation for many hours, even in the face of massed but inaccurate culverin fire. Nevertheless, this constant shelling eventually weakened the gallant Parliamentarian reserves. When Prince Rupert then led a thunderous mounted charge across the Common's northern sector at around 4 p.m, Essex's trained bands began to break, tearing open his line and threatening to scythe the entire army in two. At precisely that moment, the Earl of Essex bravely galloped onto the scene, riding among his retreating troops and inspiring them to turn around and fight. In one account, a cannonball is said to have landed only a yard from the Lord General, but his personal intervention was necessary. The trained bands, particularly their red and blue units, turned around and charged at the Royalists, reforming their formation and stabilizing the front. After some subsequent lighter combat, both armies began disengaging at 7 p.m. after a ruthless 14-hour stalemate. Charles's forces retreated all the way to Newbury, where they stayed the night and conferred about what to do. The next morning, the Royalists chose to not re-engage, either because of depleted gunpowder supplies or because the High Command simply lost its nerve. Both armies lost about the same number of troops, at 1,300 each, and even though Rupert had come close to victory, Essex escaped back to London in the aftermath. Newbury was just as tactically inconclusive as Edge Hill had been the year before. Nevertheless, the battle would have far-reaching consequences. Although the King's armies were dominant in every theatre as 1643 came to an end, Parliamentarian allies in the far north were about to change the nature of the entire war. The Royalist summer had ended. By the time October of 1643 came around, the two kingdoms of Charles I had been embroiled in a bitter civil war for well over a year. The grave consequences of this violence slowly began to reveal themselves as the months went on, as atrocities against one's fellow countrymen became even more common on both sides, while the gentlemanly warfare of the early war faded away. As the Earl of Essex and his royalist enemies were locked in the bloody First Battle of Newbury, political dealings between Parliament and the Scottish Covenanter government were reaching a conclusion which would intensify the war to an even greater degree. The Parliamentarians needed a strong military ally to win the war, and the Covenanters possessed an army ready to march. In return for a promise to implement the Presbyterian religious system in England, Scotland would help to crush Charles's royalists. After months of back-and-forth negotiation, the so-called Solemn League and Covenant was finalised on September 25, 1643. Meanwhile, the king was bolstering his forces for the next confrontation, as royalist soldiers, previously tied down in Ireland, began returning home. As 1644 began, the north of England came under decisive royalist control by the efforts of William Cavendish, Earl of Newcastle. This all changed on January 16th, when the Covenanter army, made up of 18,000 foot, 3,000 cavalry, 600 dragoons and 120 cannons, crossed the River Tweed and invaded English territory, entering the war on Parliament's side. It was led by the illustrious veteran of Lutzen, Alexander Leslie, the Earl of Leven. Leven's advance towards Newcastle was almost unopposed, but Cavendish quickly received word of the invasion and managed to beat the Scots to the city, mainly because Leven had to wait for his heavy cannons to arrive by ship. When he finally arrived before the city walls on February 3rd, he found many of the suburbs burned to the ground by Cavendish's defending force, who were now reinforced by 5,000 men. Nevertheless, the Tyneside city was put under siege. However, constant harassment of Scottish supply lines by veteran Royalist cavalry and lack of shelter, provoked by the defenders' scorched earth tactics, forced Leven to depart with most of his army on the 22nd. Only 6 regiments of the Covenanter army remained to continue the siege. Unwilling to let his enemy escape unhindered, Cavendish set out in pursuit with most of his own troops. Over the next few weeks, Leven and Cavendish maneuvered around one another, unwilling to engage because of the unfavorable terrain and bad weather. Finally, in late March, Leven engaged and defeated his foe in a close battle near Sunderland, forcing him to flee in the direction of York. By this loss, the northern forces of the king needed help immediately, and their main hope for such assistance rested with Prince Rupert, who set off towards Yorkshire to relieve Cavendish's battered host. In a brilliantly executed campaign, Rupert's meagre army broke a siege at the strategically crucial Royalist stronghold of Newark on March 22nd, with the prince almost losing his life in the attempt. Instead of continuing his march, the dashing cavalier withdrew to his base at Shrewsbury to raise more men, but barely had time to relax before terrible news came from the south. A week after Rupert's triumph in Nottinghamshire, William Waller got his revenge for Roundway Down by defeating Hopton's Royalist army at the Battle of Cheriton, a defeat which ended any prospect of Royalist victory in the south. Royalist fortunes had even begun to sour in Yorkshire, when on April 12th, an army of Sir Thomas Fairfax defeated John Bellacy at the town of Selby, and routed a significant portion of York's intended garrison. After receiving word of the unfolding disaster, the Earl of Newcastle force-marched his army for the second time in just under a year, hoping to reinforce York's defences before the parliamentarians could get there. Once again he succeeded, despite losing many stragglers and deserters along the way, reaching the northern Royalist bastion on April 15th. 3 days later, the Covenanter army closed in on Wetherby and rendezvoused with the parliamentary army of Sir Thomas Fairfax, fresh from its victory at Selby. Together, starting on the 22nd, the Allies put England's great northern city to siege. Charles I knew that if York fell, the north would fall. To deal with the sudden strategic crisis that the war effort now faced, leading Royalist commanders assembled at Oxford on April 25th for a council of war. After vigorous debate, Prince Rupert gained the upper hand. It was decided that the remnant of Hopton's defeated army would be absorbed into Charles's central army at Oxford, and this newly bolstered force would stay on the defensive. Meanwhile, Rupert himself would raise several thousand troops and go north to relieve York. With that decided, Rupert arrived back in Shrewsbury on May 6th to begin mustering his own men. On that same day, on the other side of England, the Eastern Association Army under Manchester and Cromwell took Lincoln, freeing them up to start marching to Yorkshire as well. Rupert's march began later in the month, with an attempt to assert Royalist authority in Lancashire. He first bypassed the firmly parliamentarian town of Manchester, but subsequently seized and ravaged nearby Bolton. After fighting for the town came to an end, no mercy was given, and up to 1,000 soldiers and civilians were slaughtered. This massacre helped bolster parliamentarian propaganda. After all, if the king was relying on such butchery of English people to win this war, was he truly their king? In Bolton, Rupert received a welcome surprise when 5,000 Royalist cavalry joined his army from the northeast. These were the Earl of Newcastle's horsemen, who had been prudently sent away before the siege began, as cavalry would be useless in such a situation. As Rupert secured Liverpool and cemented Royalist control of Lancashire, the king disregarded the southern defensive strategy and embarked on a military campaign in the region. It was a disaster, leading to the breach of Oxford's defensive ring of garrisons and forcing Charles to flee to Worcester, with Essex and Waller hot on his heels. At this point, the king, realizing Prince Rupert's advice to only consolidate and defend in the south should not have been ignored, sent a set of ambiguous orders, which essentially left Rupert to make his own mind up. We'll talk about this theatre more down the line. Upon receiving the communiqué, the Cavalier General interpreted the unclear command in his own way. He would relieve York, as well as destroy the parliamentarians and their Scottish allies, before victoriously marching south to save the king. After the campaign that was about to happen, he would carry that letter from the king for the rest of his life. Rupert's relief army, now about 14,000 strong, set off to relieve York. News that the prince's army was only a day away caused the allies to hastily lift their siege. They withdrew to proactively meet the royalist army, moving their large combined force onto a ridge near a village 5 miles southwest of York, known as Long Marston. The Knaresborough Road, which Rupert was using to march his army, crossed immediately in front of this ridge, with the River Nid behind it. This rendered the direct route to York almost impossible to navigate for the royalists without having a dangerous enemy army threatening their flank. Rather than risk such an attack, the wily prince resorted to deception. Just before dawn on July 1st, royalist horsemen were spotted advancing up the Knaresborough Road. To the parliamentarians and Scots, it was apparent that this force of cavalry were Rupert's vanguard, with the obvious implication that his main army was only a short while away. Accordingly, they drew up their men in battle formation and waited for the bulk of Rupert's army to arrive. However, the royalist vanguard was just an illusion, luring Leven, Fairfax and the others into a false sense of security. While it did everything that a normal vanguard was expected to do, Charles's illustrious nephew swung the majority of his army north at Knaresborough town, crossed the Ouse at Boroughbridge, and was encamped in Gultree's forest by nightfall. Then his forces advanced even further, scattering a small detachment of enemy dragoons at Nether Poppleton and securing a boat bridge there. Realizing they had been outwitted, and fearing Rupert would be able to cut their supply lines to the south if he gave them the slip again, most of Parliament's combined army began marching south to Tadcaster, while its cavalry remained at Marston Moor, covering the retreat. At about the same time, the Royalist cavalry, which had previously been ordered to leave the city by Newcastle, strode back into York under Lord George Goring and formally relieved the city. In a brilliant manoeuvre, which was arguably one of his greatest in the entire Civil War, Rupert had saved old Roman Eboracum without firing a shot. Obeying what he thought to be the king's command to relieve York, then defeat Parliament's army, and then come south urgently, Prince Rupert almost immediately gathered his own and Newcastle's men. Bolstered by the reluctant York garrison and their even more reluctant commanders, the prince marched to Marston Moor and visibly challenged the enemy to a pitched battle. By early evening on July 2, 1644, two of the Civil War's largest armies so far were lining up against one another across Marston Moor. The battlefield was bounded in the east by Long Marston village and in the west by Tockwith. The 28,000-strong parliamentarian army took position on a high ridge, while Rupert's significantly outnumbered 18,000 royalists were forced to occupy a lower section of the moorland to the north. Their position was fronted by an irregular irrigation ditch, which would function as a useful defensive equalizer. On each of the Roundhead flanks, 3,000 English parliamentarian cavalry and 1,000 Scottish troopers were arrayed in 3 lines of battle, supported by interspersed musketeers on foot. The right wing, closer to Long Marston, was led by Sir Thomas Fairfax, while the left was under the command of Oliver Cromwell, accompanied by his increasingly lethal unit of mounted troops, the Ironsides. Forming the mass of Parliament's army were 20,000 infantry in the centre of the battle line. In the vanguard were units from Lord Ferdinando Fairfax's Army of Yorkshiremen in the centre, Eastern Association Army troops of Manchester's on the left, and a brigade of Scots on the right. Behind them in the second line were more of Manchester's infantry and Leven's Scots, and even more Covenanters were in reserve. The supreme command of the entire army of both kingdoms lay with the Earl of Leven. Down the slope, Prince Rupert's feared royalist cavalry matched their opposite numbers man for man and horse for horse, possessing about 4,000 on both the left and right, under Lords John Byron and George Goring respectively. Each of these divisions were also accompanied by musketeer units. However, the Cavalier army only had 10 to 11,000 foot in the centre. It was drawn up in the Swedish style that Rupert had witnessed firsthand during his service on the continent, and was led by the Earl of Newcastle, Prince Rupert himself, and a number of brigade commanders. After a wait of several hours, the battle finally began at about 7:30 p.m. with an artillery duel on the western side of the field. Parliamentarian guns began blasting Byron's cavalry, causing a number of casualties and provoking a response from some royalist cannons which had been placed on an area of high ground just in front. This shelling caused some chaos in Cromwell's own ranks, and the death of his own nephew. The Roundhead commander kept his cool, responding by ordering his guns to advance with 2 infantry regiments as backup. Foot regiments of Prince Rupert and Lord Byron marched out to meet them, and a short firefight took place, badly mauling the royalist units and forcing them into retreat. This triumph heralded an all-out parliamentarian infantry running march down the ridge slope, as thunder began to crack and lightning flashed from above. In the centre, the brigades of Lord Fairfax and Crawford made good progress, managing to push over the defensive ditch and even capturing 4 royalist Drake-class cannons. However, not all was going the parliamentarians' way, for the Scottish infantry under Bailey had a more difficult time breaking through the enemy's ranks, bogged down by the cavalry action taking place next to them. On the battlefield's eastern wing, Sir Thomas Fairfax opened the fighting by charging 400 mounted vanguard under his personal command against a similarly sized unit of royalist cavalry opposite him. The result was a swift rout of the Cavalier horsemen in the direction of York, followed by Fairfax and his horse. However, this left most of the parliamentary forces without an overall commander, and they quickly became bogged down during the advance. Uneven terrain, bracken, hedges, and constant musketry volleys caused disarray among the leaderless horsemen, and at the moment they were at their most vulnerable, Lord Goring's troopers launched a thunderous charge, driving them from the field of battle. Just like at Edgehill 2 years before, most royalist horsemen broke ranks to chase their defeated enemy, cutting many fleeing soldiers down and plundering the Allies' baggage train beyond the ridge. Though they had won their engagement, Goring's cavalry had also left the battle. As the parliamentarian cavalry on the right was being run off the field by Goring, Oliver Cromwell rode out at the head of his first line of Ironsides and charged headlong at Lord Byron's royalist horse opposite, who countercharged across the moor to meet them. Both sets of horsemen fired their pistol carbines until they were exhausted, before wheeling around, unsheathing their sabres for a second charge. In this initial disorderly clash, it was Cromwell's horse who came off better, inflicting some casualties and slowly driving Byron back. The situation became even more serious when Colonel Vermuyden's second line rode forward to join their commander, and for a few moments it seemed as though the royalists might buckle. However, they didn't break under the pressure, allowing time for their own second line to join the fray and stabilize what was quickly becoming the largest cavalry engagement of the war. Somewhere in the chaotic fray, Oliver Cromwell suffered a blade slash to his neck, but carried on fighting nevertheless amidst his men. Witnessing the seemingly decisive clash which was taking place near Tockwith, Prince Rupert rallied his army's cavalry reserve, in addition to his personal lifeguard, feeding those units into the engagement as well. His hope was to tip the scales in favour of Charles's force by hitting Cromwell's unit in the front and sides. When almost all firearms had been discharged, and the cavalry battle had become a grinding contest of sword against sword, the parliamentarian reserve of 1,000 Scottish troopers under David Leslie came forward and swept into both of Rupert's exposed flanks. Attacked from the front by Cromwell and from the sides by his Scottish allies, the royalist front line was scythed apart and broken with heavy losses. Witnessing the ensuing massacre, their comrades in the rear broke and ran, with Rupert himself shamefully caught up in the rout. Unlike Goring's men on the other side of the field, Oliver Cromwell and his capable officers kept full control of their own highly disciplined mounted troops. Immediately bringing the pursuit to a stop before it began, they began to regroup and take stock of the strategic situation. In the centre, Lord Fairfax's initially victorious Foot Brigade was countercharged by Newcastle. Though this wasn't in itself critical, The shock of Newcastle's push also drove the 1st and 2nd Line Scottish infantry into retreat, opening a gap in the Parliamentarian line. Led by Sir William Blakiston, another small Royalist cavalry reserve nearby took the opportunity and charged into the gulf which the Scots had left, carving through the Allies' vulnerable underbelly and even breaking through their final line. However, indiscipline once again proved fatal, and Blakiston's men too rode off the field to plunder the enemy baggage. The only section of Goring's cavalry to have remained on the field then attacked the infantry units in Parliament's right centre, causing significant damage and even frightening Leven, Lord Fairfax and Manchester into fleeing the field. The combined army's foot was now in almost total disarray. Sir Thomas Fairfax returned to the field with a few hundred horses at that moment. Riding all the way across to Cromwell's position, he supposedly asked, "Major General, what shall I do?" In response, Fairfax said, "Sir, if you charge, not all is lost." Cromwell's cavalry looped around the rear of the Royalist line, scattering Goring's hastily returned cavalry, and then turned on the Cavalier infantry. This marked the end of the battle. Hundreds of fleeing Royalists were slain, and only Newcastle's so-called lambs, elite troops clad in white woolen uniforms, refused to flee and died to a man. After a battle lasting several hours, 4,000 men of the King's army lay strewn across the bloody battlefield of Marston Moor, at the cost of only about 300 parliamentarians. After being routed by Cromwell and the Scots, Prince Rupert retreated in shame with his surviving cavalry. He would obsessively keep the king's ambiguous order on his person for the rest of his life, ready to excuse his defeat if challenged. The great Earl of Newcastle, whose talents initially secured northern England for the Royalists, could not handle the embarrassment. He abandoned Charles's cause completely, fleeing first to Scarborough and then across the sea to a self-imposed exile in Hamburg. With this disaster, the parliamentarians gained complete control of the north. As Rupert's Marston Moor campaign was starting up in northern England, manoeuvres of equal consequence were taking place in the south. When we last caught up with Charles, he was escaping from Oxford to Worcester, being pursued by the parliamentarian armies of William Waller and the Earl of Essex. In a move which has since been regarded as a strategic blunder, Parliament's Committee of Both Kingdoms ordered the Thames armies to split up. Essex marched off to relieve the Royalist siege of Lyme, while Waller's cavalry-heavy force continued to pursue the king with diminished strength. Unfortunately for the latter, Charles used the opportunity to go on the offensive again, luring Waller into a trap and defeating him at Cropready Bridge on June 29th. Even worse than this were events taking place in the far southwest. After parting from Waller, Essex relieved Lyme and then even briefly managed to lift the long-running siege of Plymouth. In the process, however, Essex's reckless western march into a firmly royalist Cornwall left his forces trapped between Charles's reinforced army and the sea. Isolated from help, Essex marched south to Lostwithiel, where he would be able to make contact with the parliamentarian fleet under the Earl of Warwick from the port of Foy. The parliamentary army deployed for battle around Lostwithiel, with Essex sending a foot detachment to hold Foy town and await the arrival of Warwick's fleet. Essex then stationed the remainder of his foot regiments on the east side of the Foy River, mostly around the high ground of Beacon Hill, and at Restamel Castle on the west side of the river further north. The parliamentarian horse squadrons covered the flanks of the army while also patrolling the areas between the two main foot detachments. On August 11th, the Royalist commander Sir Richard Grenville occupied Bodmin before moving south to seize Resperin Bridge, which would allow him to establish immediate contact with the King's army on the east bank. Grenville then moved on to Lanhydrock. 2 days later, Lord Goring and Sir Jacob Astley moved south along the east bank towards the coast, and occupied Polruan Fort the next morning with 200 foot and some cannon. By seizing the fort, they effectively closed any sea access to the Foy estuary for Warwick's fleet, leaving detachments to guard Bodenick Ferry and the ground opposite Goland. Essex had been hoping for support from his old parliamentary rival Sir William Waller. Waller had sent General Sir John Middleton with a contingent of horse and dragoon regiments from his own army to reinforce Essex.
but at Bridgewater they were driven back by Royalists under Sir Francis Doddington. After its defeat at Cropredy Bridge, the rest of Waller's army could not be relied upon to provide Essex any support. Setting up his headquarters at Bocanoch, just to the northeast of Lostwithiel, on August 17th, Charles rode down the causeway along the east bank of the river at Bodenoch Ferry, where he scouted the parliamentary positions on the opposite side. Parliamentary guns opened fire, but did little damage to the king's retinue. On August 21st, Charles's army launched its attacks on the parliamentarian positions at Beacon Hill. In the early morning mists, the attack commenced at 7 a.m. Sir Richard Grenville's force advanced on the west bank against the parliamentary position at Restamel Castle, but Colonel John Weir's Devonshire Regiment of Foot hastily abandoned the castle to the Royalists. Back on the east bank, the Royalists assaulted Beacon and Druid Hills, taking both positions by storm. Advancing with a column across the Liskeard Road, Prince Maurice's forces captured the prominent hill on the far side. By the end of the day, the Royalists were firmly established on the hillsides overlooking Lostwithiel. That night, the Royalists constructed a redoubt on Beacon Hill, brought up their cannons, and began firing on the town from the earthworks. Over the next few days, the parliamentarians did very little in response to the Royalist threat across the river. This led the Royalists to believe that Essex had in fact withdrawn towards Foy Town. With this assumption in mind, Charles sent half his mounted force across the Resperin Bridge to make contact with and support Grenville's advance on Lostwithiel down the west bank of the river. On August 26th, Lord Goring's 2,000 horse and Sir Thomas Bassett's command of foot marched to the southwest towards St Blaise in order to cut off Essex's route of escape and to prevent supplies from reaching the Roundheads via the coast. Royalist detachments took St Austell and the coastal village of Parr, just 4 miles from Foy Town. Essex's army was now effectively trapped within the strip of land between Lostwithiel along the river to Foy, a frontage of only 2 miles long and wide. Meanwhile, a large Royalist supply train reached Charles from Dartmouth, replenishing his stores of munitions with 1,000 barrels of gunpowder. In contrast, Essex's army was starving and short of ammunition, desperately clinging to its position at Lostwithiel. Warwick's fleet had been prevented from sailing into the estuary by persistent westerly winds. Time was running short for Essex's army, and the general knew it. Going off intelligence gained from parliamentary deserters, on August 30th, Grenville informed the king that Essex was planning to make a breakout to the east with his cavalry, while his foot and cannons, with a small escort of cavalry, withdrew to Foy Town. The king immediately sprang into action, giving orders to his regiments to attack any parliamentary troops attempting to break out of the encirclement. They fortified a cottage on the Lostwithiel-Lichfield Road and garrisoned it with 50 Royalist musketeers in order to halt the passage of any parliamentarian cavalry moving down the road to the east. Elsewhere, Royalist horse squadrons broke down the bridge over the Tamar River. At 3 o'clock on the morning of August 31st, Sir William Balfour led the majority of his parliamentarian cavalry, around 2,000 troopers, in a breakout from Lostwithiel. The musketeers at the cottage didn't fire a shot. Balfour's horsemen galloped across the Foy River Bridge and set off on the road for Liskeard. By day's end, Balfour succeeded in crossing the Tamar by ferry, reaching Plymouth with his command largely intact. The Earl of Cleveland soon set off in pursuit the next morning with his 500-man brigade, but was unable to catch the parliamentarian troopers. On September 2nd, parliamentary foot and cannon marched out of Lostwithiel to the south, commencing their part of the escape. Major General Philip Skippon led the parliamentarian rearguard, whose colours King Charles could spot from the high ground atop Beacon Hill. The king ordered his army to advance and catch the Roundheads. At 7 a.m, 1,000 musketeers stormed across the bridge over the Foy River into Lostwithiel, preventing a parliamentarian demolition party from destroying the town and driving the remaining Roundheads out. The Royalists brought up their cannon through Lostwithiel and opened fire on the Roundheads' rearguard. Under pressure from the heavy cannonade, as well as Royalist foot assaults, Skippon's troops fell back. While the main body of the Royalist army fell upon the parliamentarian rearguard south of Lostwithiel, King Charles led his regiment of Life Guards from Beacon Hill to the river and forded the west bank south of the town. Here he met Grenville's Cornish force leading the Royalist advance. Lieutenant Colonel William Leighton of the King's Regiment of Life Guard of Foot rallied the Royalist foot regiments and led them into the fields west of Trebathenby Farm. Simultaneously, Charles launched his own mounted Life Guard in a counterattack, forcing back the Parliamentary foot through several fields and hedgerows. At about 2 p.m, the Royalist foot managed to catch up with their cavalry counterparts, and the rest of the day was spent fighting smaller, quick skirmishes. Sir Thomas Basset, coming up from St Blaise, attacked the Parliamentary left flank, whilst Colonel Appleyard led the vanguard of the main Royalist army in their assault from Lostwithiel, pressing back the Parliamentary foot regiment towards Foyt Town. At 4 p.m, Essex launched his remaining mounted squadrons with the support of his own regiment of foot in a desperate counterattack, managing to push back the Royalists and capture 2 of their banners in the action. But the King's Life Guard soon arrived and smashed into the Roundheads, forcing them back once again. Lord Goring then arrived with his retinue of horse from St Blaise, and was given orders to continue across the battlefield and join the pursuit of Balfour's Parliamentary horse squadrons to the east. Skippon launched one last effort to stem the Royalist pursuit in the early morning, with a counterattack from Castle Dore. For another hour, the Royalists were driven back through 2 fields, but then rallied and pushed back the Parliamentarians to Castle Dore. The Earl of Northampton's brigade of horse arrived and joined in the assault, but darkness ended the pursuit and the battle. Essex himself had to flee in a small fishing boat, and despite the fact his cavalry managed to escape, 6,000 footmen were forced to surrender at Lostwithiel. Alarmed at the sudden reversals of fortune so close to London, Parliament ordered Waller and the Eastern Association Army under Manchester to reinforce the west. When the king subsequently attempted to raise a parliamentarian siege on Basing House in late October, he was blocked and forced to fight the Second Battle of Newbury against an army twice the size of his own. Charles refused to withdraw and avoid a pitched battle with the approaching parliamentarian army. The Royalist army formed up in order of battle to the north of Newbury, with its right flank resting on the Kennet River, its centre strengthened by the fortified position of the Shore House, and its left anchored by Donnington Castle. On October 26th, the Parliamentary army initiated contact with the Royalists, probing their lines against the backdrop of small-scale skirmishing. On Clay Hill, Parliamentarian cannons opened a heavy bombardment against the Royalists in the Shore House. Meanwhile, the Parliamentary senior generals convened for a council of war. Probably at the behest of Waller, the Parliamentarians adopted an attack plan in which their army would conduct a circuitous march to the north around the Royalist lines, then assault their extreme left flank through Speen Village. A simultaneous attack would be launched against the eastern end of the Royalist line at the Shore House. The flanking columns would have to march a distance of 13 miles, moving through villages and across the Lambourn before turning east towards Wickham Heath to Speen. Instructions were given out that a cannon shot would signal the commencement of the attack by the flanking force, while Manchester began his own assault on the Shore House. Gathering intelligence on the Roundheads' intentions, the king shifted Prince Maurice's Cornish foot regiments and horse squadrons to Speen, where they set to work building a sturdy redoubt armed with several cannon. 3 brigades of foot occupied the ground around Shore Village, while Sir Humphrey Bennet's brigade of horses held the army's centre, with detachments further south at Newbury and the crossing points of the Lambourn at Bangor, and on the route of the enemy's flanking march at Boxford. In the early morning hours of October 27th, the Parliamentarian flanking force began its march. Before it could cross the Lambourn, it was spotted by the Royalists in Donnington Castle. The Royalist horse detachment at Boxford was driven off by the Roundheads in the late morning, and soon the Parliamentarians were crossing Wickham Heath and approaching Speen. Rather than wait for Waller's cannon signal, Manchester opened his attack on the Royalist right at the Shore House and in Shore Village. Despite initially gaining success in their attacks, the Parliamentarians under the slow-moving Manchester were driven back in disarray and confusion. Waller's flanking columns reached their attack positions at 3 p.m, but they came under a heavy artillery barrage by guns in Prince Maurice's redoubt, and from the 4 guns in Donnington Castle. 800 musketeers from Essex's army, supported by a brigade of horse, assaulted the redoubt, while the remaining parliamentary forces surged into Speen village, clashing with Maurice's Cornish infantry inside the town. Within an hour, the redoubt and Speen village had both fallen into parliamentary hands, forcing Maurice's regiments back in a confused retreat. Following up the success, Balfour led his horse squadrons in pursuit of Maurice's Cornishmen, but found themselves slamming against a reserve line outside Speen, commanded in person by the king. Through the efforts of the king's lifeguard, Charles was prevented from being captured by Balfour's troopers. As the daylight hours waned into the evening, Cromwell brought up a reserve retinue of cavalry, but apparently failed to seize the initiative and promptly attack the collapsing royalist line. Lord Goring's horse charged Cromwell's own cavalry, and before long Cromwell was being driven back. Meanwhile, Balfour's horse were coming under fire from companies of musketeers posted in the ditches and around the hedges on the outskirts of Speen. Balfour's troopers were swiftly counterattacked and driven back by a rallied brigade of royalist horsemen under Sir Humphrey Bennet. Back on the royalist right flank, Manchester began his second assault around 4:30, with daylight fast fading away. He dispatched 2 columns from Clay Hill, the right-hand column engaging the Shaw House, while the larger left-hand column moved into Shaw Village. However, both of these attacks were halted by stubborn royalist resistance and pushed back with severe losses. Before the parliamentarian advance could continue on either end of the battlefield, darkness fell on the beleaguered troops, promptly ending the engagement.
Against all odds, and despite the near capture of the king, Charles's army managed to retreat unimpeded, partially because of Manchester's reluctance to press the attack. The king's final campaigns of the year were similarly successful. Manchester once again failed to decisively attack the royalists on November 9th at Speen Hamlet, and a week later was unable to stop Charles relieving Banbury. On the 23rd, relative optimism pervaded the king's camp as the soldiers went into winter quarters. Parliament's failure to successfully end the war in late 1644 prompted recriminations and blame among the increasingly factionalized set of MPs during the winter of 44–45. More consequentially, it led radicals such as Oliver Cromwell and William Waller to begin speaking in favour of establishing a completely different style of military. It would be, as Trevor Royal put it, a professional and disciplined regular force, well paid and well equipped, under the control of an independent commander-in-chief. In short, it would be a permanent army staffed by dedicated experts, detached from the politicking of Parliament, whose sole aim was to gain victory over the king. After weeks of inquiry and debate, this new model army finally came to be on January 11, 1645, when the Commons passed the New Model Ordinance and began mustering 12 regiments of 1,200 footmen each, 10 regiments of cavalry, each numbering 600 troopers, and 1 regiment of 1,000 dragoons. 10 days later, supreme command of the new model army was granted to Sir Thomas Fairfax, due to a combination of extensive military experience, and because although he was unquestionably loyal to the parliamentarian cause, he was not a member of Parliament. Henceforth, members of Parliament were largely barred from holding commands, ending the military careers of the Earls of Manchester and Essex. Though the embryonic new model army would become immensely formidable in the course of months and years, it needed time to fill its ranks and become an effective fighting force. This necessity determined a measured parliamentary offensive strategy in the early months of 1645, and also made the continued cooperation of Leven's Scots very valuable. However, the Covenanters were becoming wary of providing too much assistance to their English allies. This was partly because the Scots feared radicals such as Cromwell would renege on the Solemn League, and partly because in Charles's northern kingdom, royalist allies were causing utter chaos. Back in September 1643, the warring factions in Ireland signed a peace which freed up English royalist soldiers to be sent over to assist the king. The agreement also allowed the Irish Confederates, whose alliances were constantly shifting, to renew their war against the Presbyterian Scots and parliamentarians. Therefore, at the end of June 1644, 2,000 Irish mercenaries raised by the royalist Earl of Antrim sailed to Ardnamurchan in Scotland under Scotsman Alistair MacColla. Upon landing, MacColla immediately began rallying Highland chiefs who were bitterly hostile to the Covenanter Campbell clan. such as leaders of the Macphersons and Macdonalds, to war. Meanwhile, in Oxford, James Graham, otherwise known as the Marquis of Montrose, had defected from the Covenanters before the Civil War began. With the threat of his countrymen's pro-parliamentarian intervention at the forefront, Charles appointed Montrose his Lord Lieutenant in Scotland and sent him north with only 2 loyal companions. When Montrose arrived, he joined with MacColla at Blair Athol, and the two immediately made common cause. This was convenient for both men, because, as Stuart Reid points out, Montrose was in need of an army, and MacColla was just as desperately in need of an employer. This ragtag army of unlikely Celtic allies and even unlikelier royalists moved south to Perth. Outside of the city, on the plains of Tippermore, Montrose and MacColla defeated a Covenanter army about the same size as their own, whose infantry was primarily made up of raw recruits. Soon they learned that a large Covenanter force was assembling at Stirling. Seeking to get clear of it and to raise local allies, Montrose marched north and bypassed Dundee on the way to Aberdeen, where another enemy army awaited him. Despite facing an army that outnumbered his own and which had taken a strong position, Montrose and his Irish colleague smashed the Covenanter loyalists again, inflicting 520 casualties and suffering only minimal losses of their own. Due to the death of his favourite drummer boy, who was shot in cold blood during pre-battle negotiations, Montrose let his troops viciously sack Aberdeen for 4 days on September 13, 1644. This event, fueled by generations-long blood feuds and sectarian hatred, would become known as Black Friday. In October 1644, Montrose campaigned throughout Aberdeenshire against his Covenanter rival, the Earl of Argyll, meeting his numerically superior forces in battle at Phoebe, where neither side was able to gain an advantage. When winter drew in, Argyll went back to Strathbogie and Montrose marched back over the hills to Blair Athol. Far more consequential than simply beating a few small Scottish armies, Montrose's actions were beginning to affect the war's greater strategic situation. The Covenanter government, growing concerned with royalist success in their backyard, ordered Leven to detach 9 regiments of his own army, led by Marston Moor veteran William Bailey, to stop Montrose. Argyll and Bailey managed to unite their forces, but constant disagreement led to the two men parting company soon after. Montrose, unwilling to give his rivals a moment to relax, undertook a perilous march and descended on Argyll's 3,000-strong army with 1,500 of his own at Inverlochy on February 2nd. Again, the Marquis won a complete victory against a vastly superior force. These events ensured that Covenanter priorities would be directed away from winning the war in England, and diverted the attention of Leven's army away from the brewing campaign of 1645. Instead, they remained in the Scottish marches to prevent Montrose from receiving reinforcements from Charles. The parliamentarians were on their own. With the Royalists lacking any real strategic direction, and Parliament waiting for its new army to sharpen its claws, campaigning in the south began in a disjointed manner. In the west, an array of the king's commanders attempted to secure the Welsh marches and take pressure off Chester. In the far south, Lord Goring ravaged Hampshire before retreating to Salisbury at the end of January. Hundreds of miles north, Marmaduke Langdale's Northern Horse managed to relieve Pontefract in early March, and was back in the Royalist stronghold of Newark by March 4th. The Committee of both Kingdoms fired the opening shot in Parliament's 1645 campaign by ordering Cromwell, who had returned from sparring with Goring's forces in the West Country, to move just east of Oxford on April 21st. Meanwhile, Fairfax led the bulk of the new model army from Windsor to Reading, where he and his 10,000 were resupplied. While the now fully supplied Fairfax set about marching west to save Taunton from siege, Cromwell repeatedly harassed Charles's forces near their capital, brazenly seizing all the cart horses which would be needed to transport artillery, and preventing the royal army from leaving. However, when Goring and his 4,000 returning cavalry encountered Cromwell at Radcott Bridge on May 3rd, the parliamentarian horse retreated south into friendly territory. With the troublesome parliamentary cavalry commander out of the way,
Charles marched from Oxford to Stow-on-the-Wold with his troops, where he conferred with prominent royalist leaders, including Goring, Rupert and others. Once again, the Council of War argued about the correct course to take, eventually concluding that Goring and 3,000 horse would split off west and bring Taunton into royalist hands, while the main royalist army would go north. Reacting to the enemy's movement, the committee changed its mind about the new model army's goals and sent its leader new orders. Reluctantly obeying, Fairfax sent 4 regiments to Taunton and turned most of his soldiers back, with the aim of an eventual rendezvous with Cromwell. The latter shadowed Charles's army from afar as it marched towards Chester, but was unable to prevent the royalists from lifting the siege there. Parliament sent messages asking Levin for aid, but Montrose's continuing success in Scotland left the Covenanters unable and unwilling to divert resources south. Partially because the committee believed that Oxford would surrender without a fight due to bad information, Fairfax was ordered to besiege the city beginning May 21st, news which reached the Royalists only a few days later. In response, Charles's field army unexpectedly pivoted and began marching southeast towards Leicester, an important parliamentary garrison, which was reached just over a week later. Aiming to distract the new model army besieging their increasingly food-deprived capital, the Royalists attacked. A savage 2-day clash over the town's defences and a veritable violent storm of cannon shot followed, after which Leicester's garrison was overwhelmed and the city stormed and looted. However, 400 Royalist troops were dead and many times more wounded, depleting the king's strength severely. Seeing the danger of continuing to fight and having gained much plunder, soldiers began to desert Charles and head home. His remaining army stayed in and around Leicester until June 4th, when it moved on to Daventry. Meanwhile, the fall of such an important Midlands garrison prompted the committee's order for Fairfax to raise the siege of Oxford and go bring Charles to battle. On June 9, 1645, 2 key decisions were made by Parliament. Firstly, Fairfax was given strategic independence from the committee. Secondly, Oliver Cromwell, Parliament's rising star, was confirmed in his assignment to the heretofore vacant position of Lieutenant General of Horse in the new model army. Realizing that a fight might be on the horizon, Prince Rupert ordered an increasingly lethargic Lord Goring to return from the West Country. However, Goring's response letter, which reiterated his temporary inability to return and pleaded the king not to fight until he did, was intercepted by the new model army. This intelligence coup had twofold consequences. It alerted Fairfax that he didn't have to worry about Goring reinforcing the king, while also depriving the king of any knowledge that he was not going to be reinforced. Now confident about their chances, Fairfax and Cromwell moved closer to the royalist position, which the efficient scouts of the new model army reported to be close by. The royalists attempted a retreat north to recruit more troops, but as they did, their rearguard was constantly harassed by parliamentarian cavalry attacks. It became clear near the Northamptonshire town of Naseby that a key decision had to be made. Prince Rupert uncharacteristically ordered a further withdrawal and avoidance of battle, but his advice was not heeded. The king would stand and fight. At this point, it's worth examining the armies which faced off on that historic day in summer 1645. Deprived of its northern manpower base, the royalist force deploying on Dust Hill near Naseby was far diminished from that which had done battle at Marston Moor the year before. Its core infantry brigades in the 1st and 2nd lines numbered 3,500 veteran soldiers, comprising 2,925 musketeers and 575 pikemen. In the left centre were the regiments of Sir George Lissell, and to his right were arrayed units under Henry Bard, as well as the Queen's personal lifeguard. In the right centre were regiments under the command of Sir Edward Hopton on the inside and the Duke of York on the outside. 3 further regiments of foot drew up in the 2nd line, while Prince Rupert, King Charles and a mixed reserve stayed in the rear, made up of the King's personal lifeguard horse and foot, in addition to Prince Rupert's bluecoats. Interspersed between the ranks of infantry were 3 small divisions of cavalry, 2 behind the vanguard and 1 more behind the second line. On the Royalist left flank were roughly 1,700 horse in 3 divisions, including Marmaduke Langdale's northern troopers. They were drawn up in the Swedish manner, with 200 musketeers lined up between each unit. Charles's other wing, anchored on a series of hedges, mirrored its counterpart in strength, and was under Prince Maurice's authority. This gathering of cavalry comprised Rupert's most elite units and lifeguard divisions, revered units which had served with distinction since Edge Hill. They also had musketeers accompanying them. Overall, the Royalist army at Naseby counted among their ranks about 10,000 to 10,500 soldiers, just over half of them mounted troops. After some prompting from Cromwell, the numerically superior New Model army took up a position on the opposing Closter Hill, the red and blue uniforms of its soldiers making it stand out on the verdant landscape. Its pike and musketeer infantry in the middle probably numbered about 8,500 in 3 lines of battle. 5 regiments were in the first, 3 manned the second, and half a regiment was in the third. The foot were led on the tactical level by Philip Skippon, one of Parliament's most veteran infantry commanders, while Lord General Sir Thomas Fairfax was with his reserve, overseeing the battle from a strategic distance. On the wings, Lieutenant General of Horse Cromwell commanded 4,000 mounted troops on the right, including the now infamous Ironsides. On the other wing was Henry Ireton, Cromwell's son-in-law, who opposed Maurice with about 2,500 on the parliamentarian left. At around 9:30 in the morning on June 14th, Cromwell surveyed the situation from his elevated position on Mill Hill. He became determined to exploit a potential opportunity in a feature which anchored the western side of the parliamentarian formation, the Sulby Hedges. The Lieutenant General energetically rode away to the rear and arrived half a mile later in the presence of a dragoon contingent under Colonel John Oakey. At Cromwell's instruction, the Colonel's dragoons mounted their horses, moved out beyond the hedgeline, and ascended the slope beyond. After riding west of the bushes for a short while, fully visible to the Royalist army, the dragoons approached Maurice's right side cavalry. There they were met by volley after volley of musketry from units who had prepared in advance for their arrival, and were forced to withdraw down a small slope for cover. From their now superior position, Oakey's dragoons laid down a withering fire on the Royal cavalry from beyond Sulby Hedge, disordering their formation and causing significant losses. Receiving reports of a developing situation on the right wing which required attention, Prince Rupert moved out from his position behind the Royalist foot to appraise the situation. Upon arriving, it was immediately clear that Maurice's horse could not withstand such harassment in their current position, and so were ordered to advance immediately. After moving out of range, the Royalist cavalry took a moment to halt, reordering themselves, before launching a thunderous charge. Opposite them, Henry Ireton's horse returned the gesture, galloping down Sulby Hill and meeting their foe at its base in a fierce clash. On the inside, closer to the infantry, Vermuyden and Ireton's units were incredibly effective, routing 3 cavalry divisions opposite them and then moving to wheel on the Royalist centre. This proved to be a mistake. Rupert's units on the outside decisively swept the parliamentarian horse arrayed against them off the field, and then turned to crash into the now distracted Ireton. The latter's forces completely collapsed at being hit in the rear, and were routed from the field, pursued towards the artillery train by the victorious units under Rupert. Once again, the prince had failed to press his advantage. At this point, about 11 AM, Charles's infantry vanguard began a forward march with its right side angled slightly ahead of the rest. Unfortunately for the New Model army, both their muskets and heavy guns fired too high, barely inflicting any damage on the advancing veterans. Upon contact, they drove through the central first line of Roundhead Foot amidst brutal close-quarters combat, in which muskets were commonly used as clubs. All of this fighting resulted in the creation of a deep semicircular salient around the victorious infantry brigades. Despite their initial success, the King's centre hadn't yet made a decisive breakthrough, and were now attacked by the new parliamentarian reserves from the front and flanks of the Bulge. As the clash of pike and musket continued, Sir Marmaduke Langdale's Northern Horse on Dust Hill's eastern edge launched their own charge. Cromwell's own first rank of cavalry mirrored their movements and prepared for the engagement. The stalwart parliamentary horse almost immediately slowed the progress of Langdale's attack. But nevertheless, the Royalists fought doggedly, gradually pushing Cromwell's first line back through the rough, narrow terrain made up of rabbit warrens and small hills. However, the northern cavalry was incredibly fatigued at this point, exhausted by the heavy fighting against the Ironsides. Although the king sent his reserve lifeguard into the fray, they stood no chance of resisting when Cromwell called forward his second line and were routed to the rear, where they sheltered near Rupert's unengaged Bluecoat regiment. Having trounced the Royalists standing in his way, Oliver Cromwell commanded an immediate halt of all his troops on the right wing, displaying phenomenal authority by maintaining order and discipline where lesser leaders would have faltered. The Lieutenant General took a few minutes to put his troopers back into a proper formation, during which he was joined by Fairfax and the remnant of Ireton's horse, before embarking on a final cavalry charge into the left flank of Charles's now struggling infantry. Pinned as they were from the front and sides, the struggling Royalist foot stood no chance of withstanding Cromwell's attack. As the king's army began to disintegrate, Fairfax, who was now up front, noticed that Prince Rupert's Bluecoats were still unbroken and refused to flee. The new model army's commander led his personal guard around the Bluecoats' rear, while another parliamentarian foot regiment attacked it in the front. Rupert's guard did not retreat and died to a man. In the middle of the slaughter, it is reported that one of the parliamentarian soldiers managed to seize the Bluecoats' regimental colours and boasted about doing so. When he was reprimanded for doing so by an officer, Fairfax personally intervened, saying, "I have honour enough, let him take that to himself." Naseby finally shattered the Royalist war machine. At the cost of only a few hundred casualties, Fairfax's new model army had killed around 1,000 Royalist soldiers, injured many more, and captured about 5,000 infantry, most of whom were Charles's battle-hardened corps of veterans. Rather than pursuing his shattered enemy any further, Fairfax immediately set about recovering Leicester, which was taken by June 18th. After its crushing defeat at parliamentarian hands in Northamptonshire, the Royalist cause in England began spinning into complete freefall. Although the king realised that his prospects were grim, he still had a few thousand good cavalry, with which he quickly travelled to the Welsh border, where there was faint hope of reinforcement. Back in the Midlands, and fresh from recapturing Leicester on June 18th, Fairfax didn't bother pursuing Charles, instead marching towards Taunton. There, the last fully constituted Royalist field army, about 9,000 strong and under Goring's command, was besieging the city. Receiving word that he was about to be attacked by the superior new model army, Goring lifted the siege and attempted to withdraw towards Bridgewater. Unfortunately for this ardent kingsman, Fairfax was too quick and engaged him at Langport on July 10th, destroying the final Royalist field force. If the destruction of Goring's army and Parliament's subsequent occupation of the West Country wasn't bad enough, Fairfax then marched north to snare Bristol, the king's last great manufacturing hub and prime gateway to Ireland. In the aftermath of Naseby, Charles valued the city's security so much that the illustrious Prince Rupert, demoralised but still fiercely loyal, was appointed its governor and ordered to keep it against the enemy at all costs. So confident was he that assurances were given to the king that Bristol could hold until at least Christmas. However, not even the man who was arguably Charles's foremost commander could withstand Fairfax's momentum. After a miserable siege of just 18 days, a hopeless Rupert surrendered Bristol on September 10th in return for mercy and an escort back to Oxford. When the king got word of the prince's abandonment of Bristol, he was utterly distraught. In response, a royal letter of condemnation was penned, containing, among other things, "What is to be done after one who is so near to me, both in blood and friendship, submits himself to so mean an action?" For the Royalists, the bad news just kept on coming. Only 3 days after the betrayal of Bristol, as conspiratorial royalist courtiers dubbed it, news reached Oxford that the Marquis of Montrose, Charles's singular ray of hope in Scotland, had been defeated at Philiphaugh with the loss of his entire army. Although the Marquis continued to cause trouble, there would be no salvation from the north. Increasingly deprived of options, the king marched north in an attempt to relieve Chester, the hypothetical landing point for any Irish Confederate soldiers who might come to aid him. He arrived on the 23rd, but was quickly bested in battle and forced to withdraw back to Oxford via Newark. The following months were an extended litany of bitter disappointment and failure among the royalist partisans. Though there were no major battles which took place, garrisons fell one by one until by early 1646, Parliament controlled most of the country. Fearing for his son and heir's safety, Charles sent the Prince of Wales to France at around this time. The final act of the First Civil War played out at Stow-on-the-Wold on March 21st, when new model units under Richard Brereton intercepted and defeated a 3,000-strong royalist contingent moving back south to reinforce Oxford's skeleton garrison. Some of the cavalry managed to break out of the trap and reach Charles's position, but the army's commander, Lord Astley, and the majority of its Welsh levies capitulated without much resistance. As he was led off the field, Astley turned to his men and said, "You have done your work, boys, and may go play, unless you will fall out among yourselves." With the armies closing in all around Oxford, Charles slipped out of the city with only 2 companions and went north. For months, covert negotiations under French supervision had been taking place between the king and the Covenanters, who were deeply unsatisfied with their treatment by Parliament. Having received promises that he would be treated honourably and would not be forced to do anything which troubled his conscience, Charles entered Levin's camp at Newark on May 5th and was taken prisoner. The king now had protection in custody, while the Scots had an invaluable piece on the chessboard. Keen to keep him secure, they moved back to Newcastle on the 13th. At about the same time, tension between the king's jailers and the English Parliament were reaching a fever pitch. On August 12th, the committee of both kingdoms' Scottish commissioners informed their counterparts that, although the war was won, they were only prepared to withdraw their army from northern England if the £1.8 million they were owed as compensation was paid. The quickly splintering factions managed to reach a financial settlement, but it was clear that, above even this, the Covenanters were furious at Parliament's disregard of the Solemn League and Covenant. Rendering the Scots' war aims even less plausible was the failure to convert the captive king to Presbyterianism, or at least to agree to impose it on his kingdom as Parliament had promised before. The king's sheer obstinance and repeated plots to escape eventually made the Scots believe that he wasn't worth the trouble. On January 28th, they agreed to sell Charles to the English Parliament in return for instalments of outstanding payments totaling £400,000. With that done, the Scottish army began withdrawing back to their own country and demobilizing after almost half a decade at war. The king, meanwhile, was transported to house arrest at Holdenby, repeatedly being met by cheering crowds on the way. In London, Parliament was not the strong, relatively united faction which had managed to win the Civil War. Instead, without Charles as a strong enemy to come together against, the rift between the Presbyterian moderates and the more radical independents grew dangerously wide. In late February and early March, members of the Presbyterian faction, who generally sought accommodation with the king, were busy shooting themselves in the foot by unilaterally disbanding the New Model Army's infantry regiments, which were often led by independents. To make the slight even more cutting, this was to be done without payments of outstanding wages that the troops were owed. The army had a number of other motivations, including the politics espoused by a group of aspiring egalitarians known as Levellers. They believed that the army's anti-royalist triumph was to herald a new age of equality and the elimination of wealth and privilege. Squabbling within Parliament continued for the next few months, until the until now relatively neutral Oliver Cromwell, who was both a prominent MP and an equally prominent New Model Army commander, began realizing his position was unsustainable. amidst rumours of a Presbyterian plot to seize the king and use him for their own political ends. Cromwell probably condoned the dispatch of an arch-agitator known as George Joyce to Holdenby at the end of May, tasked with taking the king into his own custody. On the morning of June 3rd, Charles I walked out of Holdenby House and set off for Newmarket, accompanied by Joyce's troopers. There, the politically neutral Sir Thomas Fairfax and his new model army were gathered, and the army's mood was growing more restless. In London, the revelation of Charles's military apprehension gave Cromwell the excuse he needed to cross his own personal Rubicon. Quitting Parliament entirely, he rode north to personally lead the new model army, with whom he was incredibly popular. When Cromwell and Charles first met for talks, relations were actually quite cordial, contrary to what later events would imply. The parliamentary cavalry general even informed a friend that the king was the uprightest and most conscientious man of his 3 kingdoms. Behind the scenes, however, Charles continued his clandestine communications with the Scots, aiming to keep all his options open. For the time being, Cromwell and the army had other problems to distract them. At the end of July 1647, riots, sparked by the continuing wartime tax rate, spiraled out of control in the English capital. The violence led to a number of independent MPs fleeing to the army's protection, including the Speaker of the House. Legitimized by the Speaker's presence in their camp, Fairfax and Cromwell led the new model army into London and put it under military occupation. When the situation was considered safe, the king was escorted from Newmarket and installed at Hampton Court, where the imprisoned monarch still doggedly refused any settlement which wasn't entirely on his terms. Instead, Charles hoped that the obvious divisions between the various parliamentary factions could be widened and exploited for his own ends. That political strategy initially seemed to be working well, when on October 18th, 5 Leveller officers presented the army grandees, led by Lord General Fairfax, with the Case of the Army Truly Stated. This was a revolutionary manifesto calling for radical reforms, including but not limited to the dissolution of Parliament and the implementation of a new constitution, which would give all the freeborn the right to vote. So that disruption in the new model army could be avoided, Fairfax opened the so-called Putney debates to address the issue. Although Cromwell's rejection of such a constitutional change decided the issue, the anti-monarchical nature of the discussion reached and frightened the king. Fearing for his safety, or just sick of being cooped up, Charles escaped in late November and eventually ended up at Carisbrooke Castle on the Isle of Wight, in an even less favourable imprisonment than before. If this irritation wasn't enough to harden Cromwell's attitude towards the king, the more severe intelligence that he was receiving certainly was. Just after Christmas 1647, Charles I secretly signed an agreement with the Scots, known as the Engagement, a military alliance between the king and his northern realm in return for state-enforced Presbyterianism. After much debate at the Edinburgh Assembly, those royalists who became known as the Engagers gained a majority and on April 20th, 1648, issued a declaration which accused the English Parliament of breaking the previously established Solemn League and Covenant. It also demanded uniformity of religion and the complete disbandment of the new model army, which the Scotch considered to be the most troublesome piece on the chessboard. This was completely impossible for the English, and so only a week later, the Engagers began mobilizing for war against their recently dismissed ally. But this time, however, Parliament and its renegade army were already dealing with the embers of unrest in England. In late March, a spontaneous revolt in support of the king had broken out in Wales, led by Colonel John Poyer. However, it was quelled in short order by the swiftly moving Cromwell. Meanwhile, in the north of England, the efforts of revanchist royalist commander Marmaduke Langdale were limited due to the intervention of General John Lambert. This wasn't the end of Parliament's troubles. In late May, an overly draconian parliamentary commissioner in Kent provoked an uprising, which, while enjoying some success, was eventually confined within the city of Colchester, which was put under siege on June 12th. Although all of these revolts still posed a threat on their own, Everyone on Parliament's side knew that an invasion from Scotland was imminent. As one of Charles's allies stated, "It is Scotland, and Scotland only can save the king and England. All others have their rise from the expectation of Scotland." The decisive campaign of the short Second Civil War was about to take place. The Royalist storm finally broke out on July 8th, when a roughly 10,000-strong Scottish army under the Duke of Hamilton crossed the border into northern England and linked up with Langdale's 4,000 beleaguered rebels at Carlisle. With the tables turned by the presence of this new enemy, Lambert obeyed Cromwell's orders to withdraw to the safety of Barnard Castle after suffering some minor losses. This would allow for the preservation of the Parliamentary army, while reinforcements made their way north to deal with the problem. Unfortunately for the Royalists, Hamilton was forced to call a stop to his offensive for 2 weeks, while supplies and reinforcements arrived from Scotland and Ireland. This gave Cromwell time to reach the area, and allowed the two parliamentary generals to meet at Wetherby on August 12th, forming a veteran army which totaled around 9,000 men. Unwilling to allow the invaders any opportunity to move further into the country, Cromwell sped westwards into Lancashire and down the Ribble Valley to intercept their southbound advance along England's west coast. To increase his army's marching pace, Cromwell chose to leave the parliamentarian artillery behind. Having decided on an advance deeper into Lancashire to link up with potential allies in Wales, the bulk of Hamilton's Scots came to a halt atop Preston Moor at nightfall on August 16th. They set up for the night and prepared to cross the Ribble River in the morning, while most of the Scottish cavalry was sent ahead towards Wigan on a foraging mission. Langdale's force of around 3,000 foot and 600 horse, functioning as a cavalry screen east of the Main, coalesced about 4 miles northeast of Preston at Longridge. Due to inadequate reconnaissance, the King's supporters were completely unaware that Cromwell's 9,000 were only a few miles away, encamped at Stonyhurst Park. As the sun came above the horizon on August 17th, Hamilton ordered Bailey to begin marching the Scottish foot across the river. Shortly after this, a small probing vanguard from Cromwell's army started skirmishing with Langdale's surprised men on the road from Clitheroe. Believing that the entire parliamentary force was in the area, the Royalist general rode to Hamilton personally and informed him of the situation, but the latter was convinced to continue the river crossing by his officers. With minimal reinforcements to assist him, Langdale rode back to his embattled contingent. After hours of light skirmishing, he was finally attacked by the entirety of Cromwell's army in mid-afternoon. The battlefield was a disconnected mosaic of small fields, intersected by irrigation ditches, narrow lanes and high hedges, in which the crack new model infantry units had a distinct advantage over the freshly mustered greenhorns in the Royalist force. Nevertheless, Langdale's musketeers gave a good account of themselves, and at first managed to keep Cromwell's army at bay and avoid being outflanked. However, when fighting south of the Clitheroe Road was at its height, Lambert threw his Lancashire regiment at the sector and sent the Royalist screen routing towards Preston. Accounts differ as to what happened next, but all agree that the situation broke apart swiftly after Langdale's defeat. Hamilton was trapped in Preston trying to rally the last arrivals among his cavalry coming from the north, while the small earthwork defence around Ribble Bridge was quickly taken after some new model army marksmen captured an area of high ground overlooking it. Many Scots were killed before they could cross the bridge, but Hamilton managed to cross the river on horseback and joined the majority of his forces on the south bank. With Cromwell now blocking the road back to Scotland, the exhausted Royalists could only continue on south, where reinforcements would hopefully reach them. Over the 3 days following the battle, the Scots, forced to leave behind their ammunition, were harassed constantly by Cromwell's Ironsides until they reached Winwick. There, the Scottish infantry was engaged and decimated by the veteran parliamentary footmen. Although the cavalry and leadership managed to escape, what remained of Hamilton's infantry surrendered on August 20th. At the other end of the country, an infuriated Fairfax brought the rebels in famine and disease-stricken Colchester to the negotiating table on the 27th. he was not in a merciful mood, and had Sir George Lisle and Sir Charles Lucas, defiant royalists until the very end, executed for bringing such unnecessary suffering onto the realm's innocents. Charles I was still imprisoned at Carisbrooke, but to the religious parliamentary soldiers, their former king had unjustly brought strife back to the land of England even after God's will had resulted in his defeat during the First War. Therefore, Charles was guilty of disregarding the Lord's will and deserved no mercy. For this crime against his own people, Charles was dubbed the Man of Blood, and many radicals began to clamour for harsh punishment. A famous passage, drawn from Numbers 35:33 in the King James Bible, started being echoed as an example. "So ye shall not pollute the land wherein ye are, for blood it defileth the land, and the land cannot be cleansed of the blood that is shed therein, but by the blood of him that shed it." Scotland's fragile alliance with the king utterly broke down as news of Hamilton's defeat at Preston began filtering north. Sensing blood in the water, anti-engager factions loyal to the Kirk or Church struck out and plunged Scotland into a civil war of its own. In early September, Stirling and Edinburgh were taken by Kirk insurrectionists, but it became clear that they didn't have the military advantage when the Engagers took Stirling back soon after. However, the threat of Cromwellian intervention on their border forced an agreement that formalised the anti-Engagers' legitimacy. With peace in Scotland secured, for now, a victorious Cromwell marched into the country and dined with friendly nobles in Edinburgh. Meanwhile, in England, momentous events were taking place. The viciousness and pointlessness of the Second Civil War had widened the rift between Parliament's moderates, who desired an accommodation with the king, and the radical New Model Army independents, who now wanted him gone. Charles's continued refusal to budge on religious issues during the subsequent negotiations infuriated the radicals even further throughout the later part of 1648, and this led to a temporary alliance between the extreme Levellers and the army grandees led by Henry Ireton. The army officers' patience finally ran out on December 1st, and they decided to act. Charles was forcibly returned to the mainland and installed at Hurst Castle, while Fairfax and the main force occupied London the following day. Acting on Ireton's orders and without the Lord General's knowledge, Colonel Thomas Pride marched on Parliament at dawn on the 6th and conducted what became known as Pride's Purge. MPs who voted for engagement with the king were blocked from entering the Commons or arrested, leaving a pliable rump parliament of 156 members. From that point on, the military was in control of the country, and it set about using its newfound authority to punish Charles I for his crimes. On the first day of 1649, Ireton's new puppet parliament decreed the establishment of a high court to charge the king. The captive monarch was taken from Hurst to Windsor, and then a day later to St James's Palace in London, which Parliament used as the king's jail. Before being parted from his son, Charles told the boy that "the corn is in the ground, we expect the harvest." He knew exactly what was coming. After a contentious week-long trial, the king was declared guilty and condemned to death on January 27, 1649. 3 days later, at about 2 p.m, King Charles I of England was executed with a single axe blow to the neck, prompting a deathly groan from the crowd. To his enemies, Charles I was an incompetent king and an autocratic tyrant, unprepared for the burden of ruling his realm and unwilling to concede anything meaningful. But he was also a devout Christian, a loving father, and a man who genuinely thought he was doing the best thing he could for England's people under the difficult circumstances of the 17th century. Whichever of these perspectives rang truer, the king was finally dead. On the same day, the army's rump parliament passed an act forbidding automatic succession by the late monarch's son, the future Charles II, who was an exile in the Netherlands at the time. Although he was crowned in mid-February by royalist supporters, this essentially abolished the English monarchy, and with this lack of a king, the Commonwealth of England effectively began. The death of Charles I and the conclusion of the struggle for England didn't mean everyone was at peace. Ireland had been in an intermittent state of revolt since before the First Civil War broke out, and during the conflict had often been a source of royalist soldiers. By early 1649, Irish Catholics were in an alliance with the remnant of Charles's supporters against the parliamentarians, and it was clear that the situation there needed dealing with. To do so, the Commonwealth's newly founded executive body, the Council of State, appointed the always reliable Thomas Fairfax. Much to their dismay, however, the Lord General was weary of conflict and declined the Foreign Commission. With little other choice, the council instead appointed his deputy, Lieutenant General Oliver Cromwell, to lead the Irish expedition. Unfortunately for them, leveller mutinies within some new model army regiments broke out during the spring and stalled preparations. Led by reformist figures such as John Lilburne, the radical levellers had become disillusioned by the lack of political change in England post-Civil War, and had come to believe that the king's tyranny had simply been exchanged for the tyranny of an oligarchic parliament. In what would be Lord General Fairfax's swan song action as the army's commander-in-chief, he and Cromwell rallied loyal forces against the mutineers and crushed them in a night assault on May 13th near Burford. In the aftermath, many leveller notables were executed, and the movement as a whole lost most of its political power. With the military's internal unrest resolved by early summer, Cromwell at last set off for his campaign in Ireland with 12,000 soldiers and fervent Protestant zeal against a people whom he would come to refer to as barbarous wretches. Most of Cromwell's fleet set sail on the 14th of August and arrived unopposed in the port of Dublin a day later. Ireland's royalist leadership under the Duke of Ormond believed that bleeding Cromwell dry of blood and money in prolonged sieges was the best strategy after recent defeats. To that end, much of their manpower was redeployed to strengthen strategic castles and towns on the invaders' route. One of these would-be fortresses was Drogheda, a city located on the main road from Dublin to Belfast. It possessed large medieval walls, and to make attacking it even harder, was bisected into northern and southern sections by the Boyne River, with only a drawbridge to cross between the two. However, Ormond and Sir Arthur Aston, the local commander, didn't believe Drogheda would be a primary objective for Cromwell. Therefore, they were not prepared when on September 2nd, outriders under an officer called Michael Jones appeared on the northern bank to cover the western approaches. Some minor skirmishing took place, which didn't have much of an effect, but this vanguard's arrival preceded the main parliamentary army, which marched into view on the following day. Immediately taking note of the city's geography, Cromwell concentrated his main army force south of the Boyne and left Jones's cavalry to split the defenders' manpower. Things got worse for the Irish royalist defenders when 8 heavy parliamentarian siege cannons arrived by river on the 5th. After being unloaded slightly downstream, the guns were organised into 2 batteries with converging fire, targeting the south and southeastern walls, where assault would be less costly. The plan was simple: smash 2 adjacent sections of the wall, penetrate the separate but mutually supporting breaches, and capture the Dulick Gate and Boyne drawbridge. Cromwell sent demands for Aston's surrender, but the overtures were rejected, so the assault was on. On the 9th, Parliament's cannons began a bombardment which continued for 2 days. All the while, Cromwell deployed his men to be ready for an advance through the breach. 3 regiments of infantry were placed at the eastern wall under Colonel John Hewson, while Cromwell personally led the bulk of his army and its reserve opposite the southern gate. Drogheda's centuries-old fortifications held firm against the cannonade until the 11th, when 2 holes were blown through both axes of the wall's southeastern corner. Reacting to the danger, Aston moved his command post to Mill Mount and ordered trenches to be dug around the breaches as a secondary defence. With the city penetrated, Cromwell raised a white flag of parley above his command tent to induce Aston to come and submit. When this failed, he even sent an officer with direct orders. However, believing relief to be close at hand, the royalist commander rejected for a second time. The Lord General intensified his 8-gun artillery barrage in response, each weapon firing formidable shots ranging from 12 to 30 pounds in weight. It was all too much. By midday, Droghed's walls were on the verge of collapse, and many more holes had been made. Cromwell readied his men for the attack. At 5 p.m, Colonels Castle and Hewson led their frontline units into the city and initially managed to seize a foothold beyond the wall. However, a point-blank volley of royalist musketry amid the rubble-strewn streets pushed the parliamentarians out again. Among the casualties was Colonel Castle, whose mortal wounding collapsed the vanguard's morale. Seeing his troops faltering, Cromwell ordered his reserve to advance and bolster the attack, personally taking command of a regiment and fighting in the forward rank. Inspired by their general's presence, the parliamentarians outflanked and overwhelmed Droghed's outnumbered defenders and forced Aston to send in his cavalry reserve. Doing so stripped the drawbridge of its defending soldiers and allowed Cromwell's men to storm the crucial crossing. Now surrounded and isolated on Mill Mount, Aston and his small group of comrades allowed themselves to be taken into custody. But the quarter was not going to be given on that day. For a reason which has been a matter of debate ever since, Cromwell's soldiers began massacring the captured royalists with shot, club and sword. Aston himself was reportedly bludgeoned to death with his own wooden leg in the slaughter by men who believed rumours that he kept gold inside it. With Drogheda south of the Boyne captured, parliamentarian soldiers, fueled by religious zeal and bloodlust, swarmed across the undefended drawbridge and into the northern section. Seemingly having lost control of his army briefly, Cromwell was unable to rein in his men as they began indiscriminately slaying any enemy soldier or civilian they came across. In short order, most of the city was under their control, but a few bastions of resistance still remained. At some point, the Lord General was approached by a group of officers who asked what should be done about a group of royalist soldiers resisting inside the bell tower of St. Peter's Church. Cromwell had his men pile up the church's pews and set them alight to burn out the defenders. About 40 people perished in the dreadful inferno, which was visible throughout the city. Overall, almost 3,000 defenders and 1,000 civilians were killed in Drogheda. Debate still rages as to whether the fervently religious Cromwell condoned Drogheda's bloody fate due to anti-Catholic hatred, or whether he was simply acting within the bounds of accepted laws of early modern wartime conduct. The man himself stated of the act, "It will tend to prevent the effusion of blood for the future." A month after the slaughter at Drogheda, Cromwell captured the crucial port of Wexford and put it to the sword in a similar manner. After this, the parliamentarians continued campaigning in Ireland throughout the winter and into the new year, stymieing any hope that future Charles II had of finding effective support there. Cromwell himself left his son-in-law to command Ireland and finally departed for England in May 1650, for a new emergency had emerged back home. Since mid-March, the dead king's heir had been playing two sides in a deft political game, both hoping to renew the royalist alliance with Covenanter Scotland, controlled by a Kirk party who had come to believe Parliament would never hold to its oaths, whilst at the same time hedging his bets with their enemies. Even worse than the failure to impose Presbyterianism was the commonly held fear among the Scots that England's kingless New Model Army sought to impose a similar republicanism on them as well, a prospect which was completely anathema to the Scottish nobility. All of this led to negotiations between the Covenanters and Charles the Younger, which began in March 1650 at the Dutch city of Breda. When talks ground to a halt, the king in exile placed a formidable and staunch royalist piece onto his side of the chessboard, the Marquis of Montrose. Following his defeat at Philiphaugh, Montrose had skipped between the courts of Europe, attempting to gain support, and after Charles I's execution, immediately offered his services to the late king's son. Aiming to light a fire under the Covenanters' feet, Charles sent Montrose back to Scotland with a mercenary army in April. Unfortunately for the unreservedly loyal Marquis, he was just a pawn in a merciless political game. His invasion had its hastening effect on the Breda deliberations. But that didn't stop his small army from being decisively defeated on April 27th when it was ambushed at Carbisdale. Only a few days later, Charles and the Scots signed the Treaty of Breda. In return for a sworn oath to institute Presbyterianism throughout the British Isles and the disavowal of royalists in Ireland and Scotland, especially the hated Montrose, Covenant of Scotland would grant Charles its support in restoring him to the throne. After being captured in the aftermath of Carbisdale, Montrose was taken to Edinburgh in chains, where he was hung, drawn and quartered at the end of May. The man who was among the dead monarch's most steadfast allies was cut off and left out to dry by his son. With the Breda Agreement concluded, Charles sailed from the Netherlands to Scotland, disembarking on June 23rd. Parliament looked at the situation in the far north with justified concern. A day later in London, 500 miles to the south, a special committee appointed by the Council of State convened to decide who would lead an upcoming preemptive invasion of Scotland. Their initial choice, Thomas Fairfax, declined the commission in objection to an offensive war. So, having recently returned from Ireland, Oliver Cromwell was appointed Lord General in his place. Together with around 16,000 veterans and their capable officers, the new model army went north and finally crossed the Scottish border on July 22nd. Rather than facing one of the age's greatest generals with an unprepared and undermanned army, Covenanter General David Leslie fortified a line of forts stretching from Leith to Canongate. Anchored by terrain features on both flanks, Edinburgh's defensive shield was a formidable obstacle which the Scottish army could safely muster behind. Dunbar, a seaport crucial for the invasion's logistical links, was taken without any significant resistance 2 days after the border crossing. Cromwell advanced even further along the Firth, but he was forced to halt at Leith upon encountering Leslie's defences. After a short attempt at breaking the line, the Lord General realised it wouldn't be possible before supplies ran dry. In terrible weather conditions, the Parliamentary army retreated back towards the Tweed, beginning on July 30th, but was harried by Leslie's Covenanter cavalry the entire way, suffering many losses. Slightly battered, Cromwell and his men reached Dunbar again on August 5th. At about the same time, Charles arrived at Leith. Parliament's Lord General tried for a second time to overcome the bulwark of forts by outflanking Edinburgh to the south, but failed again due to an onset of dysentery and the wet summer weather. On August 31st, Cromwell pulled the attrition-sapped army back to Dunbar, his strength now only 7,500 infantry and 3,500 cavalry. Perceiving a chance to cripple the already weakened New Model army, Leslie sent one of his infantry brigades around to take the pass at Cockburn's Path, beyond Dunbar, cutting Cromwell's line of supply, reinforcement and retreat. Meanwhile, the bulk of his army, about 14,000 men, secured the prominent Doon Hill, overlooking both Dunbar and the Berwick Road. Such impregnable high ground would have usually served as a tactical benefit, but never-ending wind and rain hammered Leslie's exposed troops stationed at the hilltop. That, in addition to a deteriorating supply situation and Cromwell's seeming weakness, prompted the Scots to descend Doon Hill at dawn on September 2nd. There, in the cover on lower ground, they deployed for battle just south of the Broxburn Ravine, prompting the observing Cromwell to declare, "God is delivering them into our hands, they are coming down to us." Brushing off concerns from some of his less bold officers, Cromwell ordered his exhausted, hungry army forward, drawing it up in a conventional battle line along the ravine and opposite the Scots. A minor skirmish between scout units took place near Brand Hill, but the remaining daylight was mostly used for redeployment. At some point, Leslie ordered the majority of his cavalry, about 18 regiments of it, to swap flanks and mass on the Berwick Road where the Broxburn was easier to cross. The unpassable inland flank was now guarded mostly by the Scots infantry. Night fell, with the Parliamentary command no less worried than they were before. The army was exhausted, its supply situation was sketchy at best, and they were trapped in Scotland with an enemy army between them and home. To decide what the best course of action would be, Cromwell called a war council in the early hours of September 3rd. Most of the regimental colonels reiterated a desire to ship the infantry away and break out with cavalry. But Major General John Lambert dismissed the prospect, inspirationally arguing for an attack. In his view, Leslie's Scots sat in an incredibly vulnerable position. Having descended from Doon Hill's lofty heights, their backs were now literally to a wall. With a bit of skill and luck, the Scottish flank could be turned, and they could be smashed against that very wall. Still somewhat nervous, Cromwell and the other officers consented. Under the cover of darkness, the English began breaking apart their conventional formation and drawing up in one single column on the Berwick Road, one brigade behind the other. The advance began at 4 AM with a cannonade against the half-asleep Scottish left and the rapid seizure of crossing points across the Broxburn by Monk's infantry vanguard and some supporting cavalry. During a subsequent half-hour lull in the fighting, Leslie's officers failed to shift their forces to effectively counter Cromwell's attack plan, and were routed. Lambert crossed the ravine with his first mounted line not long after, and charged at his fellow Major General Montgomery's Scottish horsemen opposing him. Surprised by the New Model Army's vicious dawn assault, Leslie's beleaguered trooper front line on the right wing was swept from the field. At about the same time, Monk crossed the Broxburn with his highly trained infantry brigade just to Lambert's right, and marched it straight at an opposing unit of newly raised Scots recruits, led by General Lumsden. It wasn't even a challenge, for Monk ploughed through his opposition with ease and broke the unit, injuring and capturing Lumsden in the process. Despite their relatively swift collapse, Lumsden's greenhorns had held just long enough for reinforcements under Campbell of Lower to come forward. They charged into and utterly smashed Monk's tired brigade in brutal sword-point fighting, knocking it totally out of the battle and shoring up the line. That wasn't the worst of Parliament's troubles. While Lambert's victorious cavalry were still regrouping for another manoeuvre, Colonel Strachan's second line of Scots troopers surged forward and struck, throwing Lambert back across the Broxburn in defeat. Fortunately for the Major General, he also had a second line which he brought forward to reinforce the left wing, charging straight into Strachan's men and pinning them down in a head-on fight. While he did so, Cromwell steered his personal mounted guard and swung around near the coast, careening into the Scottish wing. This was the final straw that broke the camel's back. All of the cavalry units on Leslie's seaward wing broke, either dying where they stood or routing. Some of them barreled back down the road to Cockburn's Path, and others wheeled around towards Haddington. However, there was no pursuit. Discipline had always been one of the Ironsides' greatest character traits, and they showed it once again at Dunbar when Cromwell and Lambert called an immediate halt. As they had at Marston Moor and Naseby, the Parliamentary horse regrouped in good order. Now exposed due to their cavalry being blown away, the unengaged brigades of Leslie's left side infantry were totally unprepared when the New Model infantry pivoted and began rolling up their line against the Doon Hill. Cromwell and Lambert delivered the coup de grace by riding into the Scots' rear, destroying Campbell of Lower's unit, which fought to the last man. There was nothing left for the Scots to do but run. Those few who could ran away from the battlefield in the same direction that their mounted comrades had, but hundreds were slaughtered. Stunningly, up to 6,000 of Leslie's soldiers were captured in the disaster at Dunbar. The general himself retreated to Stirling Castle with a few thousand escapees. With Scotland's army shattered, Edinburgh capitulated to English parliamentary forces on September 7th. But the Third Civil War in Scotland and England would continue. The final campaign of Britain's terrible 9-year-long series of conflicts was fought in the late summer of 1651, when Cromwell lured Charles into invading England from the north. Leaving Lieutenant General George Monk behind in Scotland to oversee a force of 6,000 of his worst soldiers, Cromwell gathered the rest of his army and hurried south, marching 20 miles a day in some of the hottest summer weather in recent memory. Within a week, Cromwell's Puritans had reached the River Tyne, entering the little border town of Ferrybridge on August 19th. From here, Cromwell instructed Lambert to continue screening Charles's army. Thanks to Lambert's effective cavalry scouts, Cromwell knew the Royalists' every step. Cromwell was surprised yet gratified to learn that the local population in northern England still clung to the Puritan banner rather than supporting the Royalist cause. The common folk here perceived Charles's entry into northern England as an outright invasion by Scottish brigands. All across northern and central England, county militias were formed and moved into key positions to block any Royalist activities and defend the capital of London. Although Cromwell held a deep disdain for the militias, their sheer size and pool of available volunteers helped demoralise Charles and his Scottish army, forcing them to halt and rethink their strategy. 16 miles east of Liverpool along the River Mersey at Warrington, Charles's army encountered a mixed contingent of Cheshire and Staffordshire militia companies, augmented by Lambert's veteran cavalry squadrons. The Royalists attacked on August 16th, forcing the Puritans back from the bridge over the Mersey, since the swampy terrain made mounted combat by Lambert's horse troops impossible. He was also under orders not to bring on a general engagement, and so the cavalry withdrew, much to the joy and delight of the Scots, who brandished their swords and taunted the retreating horsemen. Although Charles had won a nearly bloodless victory at Warrington, his principal advisors were still deeply troubled. Leslie was the most concerned, noticing that there was little evidence of large-scale defections to the Royalist cause. Faced with similar concerns from his other advisors, Charles relented and gave up on his hopes of marching directly on London, instead opting to move west into the Loyalist-leaning territories along the Welsh border. He believed that he could recruit more Royalists to his cause in the western counties, especially from the hard-fighting Welshmen. It also gave him an open line of retreat to the coast if the situation made it necessary. Reluctantly, Charles ordered his army to shift west, heading for the crossroads town of Worcester along the River Severn, which forms the eastern border of Wales. The Royalists, weary and exhausted from their march, arrived at Worcester on August 22nd and immediately began strengthening the town's defences. Charles ordered all local males between the ages of 16 and 60 to assemble in a field outside Worcester, where they listened to an impassioned speech by the king, who implored the men to join the ranks, promising good pay and a pardon to any who joined his cause. Just a few hundred recruits joined his army, but it would not be enough to face the much larger Puritan army under Cromwell, which scouts reported was closing on their position. Charles told one of his close confidants, "For me, it is a crown or a coffin." 2 days later, on August 24th, Cromwell arrived in Warwick, 40 miles east of Worcester. Here he combined his battle-hardened regular regiments with a large contingent of volunteers to form a 27,000-strong army. Cromwell could now, for the first time in his career, have a 2-to-1 advantage over his adversary. Charles attempted to even the odds against Cromwell by sending Sir Edward Massey and 300 men to watch over the nearest crossing point of the Severn 9 miles south of Worcester at Upton. Massey was under orders from Charles to destroy the lone bridge spanning across the river, but for some unknown reason, Massey delayed in this action. Meanwhile, Lambert arrived on the scene with his cavalry scouts, finding the bridge neither destroyed nor guarded. He sent a squadron of dragoons running across the bridge in order to seize the high ground at Upton Church. Now alerted to the enemy threat, Massey counterattacked, but Lambert sent in more reinforcements and forced the Royalists into a retreat. Massey was badly wounded during the skirmish, needing to be carried off the field. With a secure foothold on both ends of the river, Cromwell dispatched a column of regulars and militiamen under Lieutenant General Charles Fleetwood to reinforce Lambert's position and widen the beachhead. Before long, 14,000 parliamentary troops had gathered on the western bank of the river, forcing Charles to divide his already badly outnumbered garrison. Many of Charles's senior officers were becoming dispirited at the rapidly deteriorating situation in Worcester. In the meantime, Cromwell moved deliberately, concentrating the bulk of his army on 2 hills, Red Hill and Perry Wood, to the east of Worcester. He placed his batteries of heavy artillery between the 2 hills, but held off from firing to allow his men to build a pontoon bridge across the Severn at its confluence with the shallower River Teme. Fleetwood would lead the crossings there, while Colonel Richard Deane led a second column to assault Powick Bridge, just a few miles west of the Severn. Opting not to attack Worcester head-on, Cromwell wanted to manoeuvre his army to trap the Royalists in a tight noose around the city, forcing Charles to abandon his favourable defensive position to attack Cromwell in a pitched battle east of the town. It was the same plan he had used at Dunbar a year earlier. Just before 6 AM on September 3rd, 1 year after Cromwell's great victory at Dunbar, the Battle of Worcester began, when the Puritans launched their attack. The 5,000 men under Fleetwood moved west up the banks of the Severn, slowing their movement to cover a 20-boat caravan heading towards the pontoon bridge site further east. As Charles watched these developments through his telescope in the tower of Worcester Cathedral, he dispatched 2 brigades under General Robert Montgomery to hold the line at the Teme. Colonel Sir William Keith's brigade was dispatched to hold the Powick Bridge, while Major General Pitscotty's Scottish Highlanders were ordered to engage the Puritans in their bridge crossing efforts at the river confluence. Most of the cavalry under Leslie moved north of Worcester, where the nervous general kept his troopers out of the fight. The Cavalier was already planning to cover a retreat from the field. The Scottish defenders at the confluence, rallied by a brief appearance from Charles to their post along the Teme, held their ground firmly against the stout Puritan assaults. The Highlanders even managed to beat back several of the enemy's attempts to cross the stream at Powick Bridge. Meanwhile, Fleetwood's pontooning efforts further east were finding little success. Seeing a lack of progress, Cromwell sent a contingent of troops across the Severn by boat in order to guard the contested triangle between the junction of the 2 rivers. He ordered the men to throw up pontoon bridges at pistol shot, only 50 yards apart from the Royalists, in preparation for reinforcements to exploit a breakthrough. Despite coming under heavy fire, the Puritan pontooners managed to build their bridges, and between 3 and 4 PM, Cromwell personally led a hand-picked retinue, including his own bodyguard and the veteran foot regiments of Colonels Francis Hacker, Richard Ingoldsby and Charles Fairfax, across the river. The Highlanders, meanwhile, were poorly led by Pitscotty, who were too far away to fight off the growing Puritan beachhead. Puritan horse reinforcements managed to sweep around the defenders' flanks on the open ground west of the river. Now that pressure to his front had been partially relieved, Fleetwood finally placed down his own pontoon bridge across the Teme to threaten the Scottish flank at Powick Bridge. Colonel Keith led his troops in a strategic withdrawal towards Worcester, fighting over every tree, bush and hedgerow between the bridge and the town. Finally running out of ammunition after hours of combat, the Scots were routed, breaking ranks for refuge in Worcester, while others hurried to escape the Puritan trap around the town. In the midst of the growing confusion, Colonel Keith was badly wounded, and Montgomery was captured. Back at the cathedral in Worcester, Charles decided he would lead his men out of the city, just as Cromwell was hoping, and oblige the Puritans to a pitched battle east of the Severn at Red Hill. As more and more of Cromwell's regiments were pouring into the triangle west of the Severn, Charles believed that a sudden, spirited countercharge might break through the Puritan lines. Leading his men out of the city, Charles's Royalists overran the poorly trained militia and musketeer pickets behind a stand of hedgerows, drove off a troop of Puritan horse, and even managed to capture Cromwell's artillery. For a moment, the fate of the battle, and the fates of both Cromwell and Charles, hung in the balance. The courageous charge by Charles, ably assisted by the Duke of Hamilton, was on the verge of achieving a stunning triumph in the 11-hour battle. But the ever-dependable John Lambert stood firm with his horse squadrons. With his own mount shot from under him, Lambert assumed command of the untried militia companies, holding firm against Charles's attacks until Cromwell could hurry reinforcements back across the river. All the Royalists' hopes for victory were dashed as they launched desperate attacks against the stout Puritan line. By 5 PM, the battle was coming to an end, although there were still small firefights and instances of last-minute actions erupting across the lines. Among the dead was the Duke of Hamilton, whose own father had been an earlier victim of Cromwell. Many of the Scots sought refuge in the earthwork defences of Fort Royal, a small redoubt overlooking Sidbury Gate. Despite a personal plea from Charles to come out and fight, the Scots would have no more of it. The redoubt's defenders would later refuse a call of surrender from Cromwell, and 1,500 Scots would die fighting, cut down to the last man by the Puritans. Defeated but not panicked, the young king rushed through Worcester in an attempt to rally his men for another charge. Leslie was of no use to the beaten monarch. At the Sidbury Gate, Charles made one final effort to rally his men, but it was too late. Frustrated, he shouted out, "I had rather you would shoot me than let me live to see the consequences of this fatal day." Instead, royalist cavalry troopers, led by the Earl of Cleveland, galloped down High Street to buy time for Charles to escape through the northernmost St. Martin's Gate. Overrun on three sides, the royalist army was completely destroyed, with 2,000 defenders in Worcester killed. The streets and gutters of Worcester ran red with blood. Another 6,000 to 10,000 royalists were captured that day, including all the surviving Scottish commanders. The English captives would be conscripted into the new model army and sent to Ireland for further service. The less fortunate Scots were deported to New England, Bermuda and the West Indies to work a life of indentured servitude on English plantations. Very few of the Scots who had invaded northern England that summer ever saw their homeland of Scotland again. The fighting had all but ended by nightfall. Cromwell announced that night the stunning victory of Parliament over Charles. The would-be King Charles managed to escape the battle, managing in one episode to elude parliamentary patrols by hiding in an oak tree on the grounds of Boscobel House. He eventually reached the southern coast of England and made his escape to Normandy. Charles would not return to his native country for another 9 years, living in exile in France, the Spanish Netherlands, and the Dutch Republic during that time. The crushing defeat at Dunbar had dealt a mortal blow to the Scottish cause, and by 1652 the kingdom was fully absorbed into the natal Commonwealth of England. After this, Cromwell's young regime had assumed control over the whole Isle of Great Britain, but there were still affairs of the state beyond the island's shores for him to settle. The brutality of Cromwell's army during the Irish campaign that occurred between 1649 and 1650 is considered by many to be a black stain on the career of an already controversial man, and his policies in Ireland in the years that followed did little to improve his reputation among the denizens of the Emerald Isle, both past and present. The massacres at Drogheda and Wexford had only inflamed the Catholic Gael's resolve to push back against the Puritan tide. But by the end of 1651, the last major native strongholds of Limerick and Galway had been put under siege by parliamentary forces and starved into submission. After this, the Irish no longer had the resources or manpower to take the new model army head-on, but they continued to fight on using asymmetrical guerrilla tactics. As many as 30,000 men went into hiding in bogs, mountains and forests. Living as outlaws, they struck out against isolated patrols and supply wagons, turning the entire countryside into a practical kill zone for any English soldier who dared step more than 2 miles beyond his military camp. Cromwell's response was indiscriminately brutal. Under his purview, parliamentarian forces systematically destroyed the food stocks of any counties suspected to be supplying the rebels. This resulted in an island-wide famine, which in turn facilitated an outbreak of bubonic plague. In total, the combination of warfare, famine and disease took a catastrophic toll, killing anywhere between 20 to 40% of Ireland's total population. Additionally, another 50,000 or so Irish captives were reduced to indentured servitude and shipped overseas to the English colonies in North America and the Caribbean. In 1652, fueled by his disdain for the Catholic faith and his desire to put an end to unrest on the island once and for all, Cromwell instituted a slew of openly discriminatory policies against the native population and its church. All Catholics were banished from all major Irish towns, which had been predominantly Anglo-Protestant in character since before the war, while bounties were put on Catholic priests, who were hunted and executed. On top of all this, massive swathes of land were seized from Catholic landowners, even those who had not taken part in the rebellion, and given to Protestants, often veterans of the new model army. By 1652, Ireland was at England's mercy, and all three kingdoms in the titular War of the Three Kingdoms were under the full control of Oliver Cromwell's regime. However, his English Commonwealth still had one more war to fight. For decades, England and the Dutch Republic had been chummy with one another, with the former supporting the latter in its war for independence against the Spanish Empire. However, throughout the English Civil War, these relations had become increasingly strained, as both royalists and parliamentarians had placed embargoes on Dutch merchant ships suspected of trading with the opposite side. This, in combination with a slew of other trading disputes born from the consequences of wartime chaos, resulted in the outbreak of open war between the two powers. Ultimately, neither side was able to decisively crush the other in this conflict, which was overwhelmingly fought at sea. However, the English emerged with the upper hand, with their freebooting privateers having invoked the spirit of Sir Francis Drake and wreaked havoc among Dutch merchant shipping lanes, crippling the Hollanders' economy. From the moment he had relieved King Charles's royal neck from his royal shoulders, Cromwell's natal Commonwealth had been in an incredibly precarious position. However, after his parade of military triumphs, from the subjugation of Scotland and Ireland to the humbling of the Netherlands, his infantile English Republic had gained international legitimacy, earning official recognition from the French, Spanish, Dutch and Danes, asserting control over its New World colonies in Barbados and North America, and nullifying any further threat of royalist invasions. Although the military record of Cromwell's Commonwealth was practically glowing, its domestic situation left much to be desired. By 1651, Parliament was essentially a skeleton crew, down to half its original membership due to extensive purges during the Civil War. This chronically understaffed body politic, known as the Rump Parliament, proved itself utterly incompetent at composing legislation, such as when they passed the 1651 Navigation Act, an aggressively protectionist import and export policy which directly led to the aforementioned war with the Dutch Republic. Following the deposition of their monarchy and the dawn of a new age, the people of England, Cromwell included, were clamouring for extensive reforms. In this, the Rump Parliament also consistently failed to meet expectations, failing to address the religious and social issues of their day, and in general just failing to get anything done except for the self-congratulatory re-election of their own members. By the 20th of April 1653, Cromwell had grown fed up with this incompetency and gathered his army to eject the MPs from Westminster at gunpoint, temporarily eliminating all vestiges of civilian government in the Commonwealth and putting the military back in charge of England. Thereafter, Cromwell and his High Army Command took the formation of a new parliament into their own hands. By July 4th, they had appointed 140 new men to Westminster. This new parliament, known as the Nominated Parliament, was an unelected body, chosen not by the people but by a small group of military elites. In theory, its members were supposed to represent the diverse peoples of England, Wales, Scotland and Ireland. In practice, the representatives from Scotland and Ireland were English soldiers who had been appointed there after the English Commonwealth's subjugation of those two countries. Cromwell's rationale was that, by handpicking only people who were appropriately godly and sympathetic to religious reforms, that he would form a state apparatus that was unified in purpose and would actually get stuff done. Unfortunately, just being godly and generally open to change turned out to be too broad a qualification. Ultimately, the nominated parliament became an eclectic mess of colliding worldviews, with pragmatic lawyers who wanted sensible legal revisions clashing with doomsday preachers, esoteric mystics, and all other manner of religious zealots. This ideological schizophrenia ultimately paralyzed any attempt at productive cooperation, and after 5 months of constant infighting, the nominated parliament dissolved itself on December 12, 1653, and returned power back to Cromwell and the army. For the second time in 8 months, the existing government and constitution had collapsed, and in the resulting power vacuum, effective governmental control had reverted to the military and its commander-in-chief. Cromwell is often portrayed as a power-hungry tyrant, but to his credit, despite being given every opportunity to become a military dictator, he consistently tried to make a representative civilian government work. After the collapse of the nominated parliament, he and his military elites went back to the drawing board. By the 16th of December, one of his most decorated field commanders, Major General John Lambert, had come up with a new blueprint for governance. This was a document known as the Instrument of Government, which holds the distinction of being the first sovereign codified and written constitution in English history. The Instrument of Government proposed a government of 3 tiers. The first tier would be a parliament of 400 men, who this time would actually be elected by the constituents they represented. The second would be a 15-man Council of State. The third tier would be the Lord Protector, a single man who held supreme executive power and would serve as the head of state. It should come as no surprise whatsoever which man was assigned to take up this prestigious mantle. On the 16th of December 1653, the new government was put into place, and Cromwell was officially inaugurated as the Lord Protector of the Commonwealth of England, Scotland and Ireland. Despite his new grandiose title, Lord Protector Cromwell was not an absolute dictator by any means. All 3 branches of his new government had checks upon each other, while the Lord Protector himself required the majority consent of his Council of State before taking many actions, such as making use of the military when Parliament was not sitting or declaring war on foreign powers. Unfortunately, Cromwell's lofty ideals of a free and representative democracy did not survive the realities of what such a thing entailed. Since elections for the first Protectorate Parliament were held freely, it resulted in many of Cromwell's enemies being sent to Westminster, including Scottish Presbyterians, Royalists, fierce critics of the new model army, and members of the old Rump Parliament, who had a bone to pick with the Lord Protector for having run them out of their previous job at gunpoint. It did not take long for Cromwell to become fed up, as his political goals were consistently thwarted by his opponents in Parliament, who were constantly trying to limit the Lord Protector's power and reduce the size of his army. Meanwhile, all the way over in the New World, Cromwell's navy captured the island of Santiago from the Spanish, which would become the English colony of Jamaica. In early 1655, Cromwell's contentious relationship with the First Protectorate Parliament came to a head when they tried to pass a radical constitutional reform bill that would increase their power at Cromwell's expense. The Lord Protector's response was blunt and authoritarian. On January 22nd, he dissolved Parliament. There was a poetic irony in this action, for it ultimately made Cromwell just as despotic as the late headless Charles I, who had been equally happy to take the proverbial ball and go home whenever Parliament had not towed his party line. Cromwell's slide into authoritarianism continued in March, when one Sir John Penruddock, a devout royalist, launched an uprising against the Commonwealth to restore the Prince-in-Exile Charles II to the throne of England. This revolt was, to put it bluntly, pathetic. Penruddock was barely able to muster more than 300 men to his cause, and the insurrection was put down within less than 3 days. Penruddock may have been as much of a threat to Cromwell as an ant is to a boot, but his uprising gave the Lord Protector the excuse he needed to scrap the constitution and install a military dictatorship known as the Rule of the Major Generals. In this new system, England and Wales were split up into 12 districts, each ruled directly by a titular Major General from Cromwell's army. In a reflection of Cromwell's own religious leanings, these military despots were often dour, joyless Puritans who banned ungodly behaviour such as music, heavy drinking, dances, fairs, and the celebration of Christmas. Unsurprisingly, these no-fun-allowed generalissimos were extremely unpopular among the general population and resulted in a plummeting of public support for Lord Protector Cromwell and his regime. By 1656, Cromwell had buckled under public pressure, thrown his major generals under the proverbial bus, and reconstituted Parliament. However, this second Protectorate Parliament was downright regressive compared to the first. For one thing, its members were no longer democratically elected, but, like the nominated Parliament, were hand-picked by Cromwell from among his supporters. Any dissidents in the first Protectorate Parliament who had opposed him had been purged. On the 26th of June 1657, Oliver Cromwell was ritually reinstated as Lord Protector in Westminster Hall. This lavish ceremony was a coronation in all but name. Cromwell was sat upon King Edward's chair, invested with a purple ermine-lined robe and bestowed upon with a sword of justice and a sceptre. It should be noted that although Cromwell's toady parliament had offered to crown him king, he adamantly refused, insisting on maintaining the title of Lord Protector. However, with his slide into authoritarianism and his utter contempt for dissenting political voices, it was clear that the firebrand general who had deposed a tyrant on the principles of republican liberty was gone. Oliver Cromwell was now a monarch in all but name. Seeing their once dogmatic and revolutionary leader turn into the very thing they had fought to oppose, many of Cromwell's closest supporters began to turn on him. By the end of 1657, the Parliament, which was supposed to be stacked with his puppets, had even begun to defy him, readmitting former MPs from his previous political purges. By now, Cromwell was simply running out of steam. By 1658, the Lord Protector's health was beginning to decline, and in August of that year, his daughter died of disease at the age of 29. After that, Cromwell had more or less given up. A lifetime of fighting, politicking, and clinging to power had taken its toll. God's chosen Englishman had deposed the monarchy, but ultimately failed to establish a stable government in its place. On the 3rd of September 1658, Oliver Cromwell died of sepsis following a urinary infection. His son, Richard Cromwell, succeeded him as Lord Protector, but Richard's rule was dead on arrival. Unable to control either Parliament or the army, he was quickly deposed. In his place, the Rump Parliament that his father had dissolved in 1653 resumed control over the country. In the ensuing political chaos, a royalist general, George Monk, seized control of the Rump Parliament, which ultimately facilitated a royal restoration. On the 29th of May 1660, Charles II entered London after a 10-year exile and reclaimed the throne that his father had lost. The royal house of Stuart was officially back in power, and England's republican experiment was officially over. We will talk about the history of Britain and early modern history in general in the coming weeks and months, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see it. Please consider liking, subscribing, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Recently, we've started releasing weekly Patreon and YouTube member exclusive content. Consider joining their ranks via the link in the description or button under the video to watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.